His face slammed into the ground so hard his teeth chattered, his mouth filled with dust. Someone kicked him in the side and yelled at the outcast to get up and accept his allotment. Yoon Ha Min opened his eyes and saw a square of gray earth in front of him, marked off with white rope. 1 meter by 1 meter. Not a blade of grass, not a bug, not a single crack or root. The earth was as dead as a concrete slab. A guard tossed a tin plaque with his name stamped on it at his feet and galloped off without looking back. The plaque bore 3 words, Yoon Ha Min, 1 square meter, for life. He crouched down and tried to remember who he was. His head was empty and echoing like an empty barn. Then it came back. Not all at once, but in bits and pieces. Seoul, the lab, the desert in Mongolia where he'd spent 3 years restoring dead soil, biochar samples in the back seat, the highway near Gangneung, the steering wheel, darkness. Ha Min touched his face. His hands felt like someone else's, younger, thinner. His wrists were rubbed raw by a rope down to the flesh. On his left forearm, a brand in the shape of a crossed ear of wheat was darkening, the mark of an outcast. He didn't know this world. He didn't know this body. He didn't know why he'd been dumped on the side of the road in the middle of a scorched plain with just 1 meter of cursed earth. But he knew the earth. Ha Min bent down and picked up a pinch of gray dust. He rubbed it between his fingers. He sniffed it. He licked his fingertip and froze. Then he laughed quietly and completely out of place. The redox potential is lower than in the Gobi Desert. The acidity is off the charts. There are so many salts it stings the tongue. 0 organic matter. It was the deadest soil he had ever seen in his entire career. And that was exactly why he was laughing. Because for an agronomist restorer, dead soil isn't a death sentence. It's a blank slate. He looked up at the sky and saw 2 moons. One was big and yellow. The other was small and blue. Ha Min blinked. Then he shrugged. 2 moons, so be it. The main thing was that there was a sun, and there had to be water somewhere, because the dust beneath his fingers wasn't completely dry. Somewhere deep below, something was still alive. He stood up and looked around. A plain covered in gray dust stretched out all around him. Far to the east, a village was visible. Plumes of smoke rose above the rooftops. A dirt road, rutted and broken, led in that direction. To the west stood a forest, dark and dense. Nothing to the south. To the north, mountains barely visible through the haze. Not a single person around, except for the dust on the horizon from the guard. Ha Min looked at his meter again. Then he sat down next to it and began to think. The first thing he needed was water. The second was organic matter. Anything. Rotten leaves, manure, food scraps. Anything that rots and decomposes. Third, time. The soil won't come back to life in a day, but if he does everything right, the first sprout might appear in 10 days, maybe in 20. It depends on the temperature and whether he can find at least some microorganisms in the area. He ran his finger along the crack in the center of the square and stumbled upon something. Small, dry, curled up, an earthworm, dead, dried out to the consistency of wood shavings. Ha Min picked it up in his palm and stared at it for a long time. This worm meant that there had once been life here, a long time ago, maybe 100 years ago, maybe 200, but there had been. If earthworms had lived here, then soil could live here too. He just needed to give it back what had been taken from it. He placed the earthworm back into the crack and stood up. The village to the east was an hour's walk away. Ha Min set off. His legs were weak and buckled beneath him. This body of Yoon Ha Min's had apparently not been properly fed for a long time. Every step was a struggle, but he kept going. Because during his freshman year at the Agricultural University in Seoul, he was told one thing that he remembered for the rest of his life. An agronomist is not someone who waits for rain. An agronomist is someone who goes to get water. The village was called Chochon, a rural hamlet. 24 houses made of clay and straw, cattle pens, a well in the village square. The people looked at him and turned away. The brand on his arm told them everything they needed to know. An outcast, a criminal, a subhuman. Ha Min didn't ask for food. He didn't ask for water. He went to the garbage pit behind the village. There lay a pile of rotting vegetables, cabbage cores, potato peelings, sour radishes, fish bones, ash from the stoves. To the residents of Tochon, it was trash. To Ha Min, it was gold. He began to gather it. With his bare hands, he stuffed the rotten scraps into the hem of his shirt. The stench was so strong it made his eyes water. 2 boys came out of the village and started throwing stones at him. One hit him in the shoulder. Ha Min didn't turn around. Then an old woman approached and asked what he was doing. Ha Min replied that he was taking what they didn't need. The old woman looked at him as if he were crazy and walked away. Behind him, he heard laughter. The outcast eats scraps. The outcast rummages through the trash. Ha Min filled the hem of his shirt and headed back. Halfway there, he stopped and unbuttoned the last button on his shirt, a bone button, darkened by time. He returned to the village and traded it with the old woman for a bucket of rotten vegetables and a handful of ashes from her stove. The old woman decided he'd finally lost his mind and gave it to him without haggling. Ha Min dragged the bucket to his plot. He sat down next to it and began to work. First, he dug a hole right in the center of the square. He dug with his fingers because he had no tools. The soil was so dense that his fingernails broke. He dug until he'd carved out a hole as deep as his palm. Then he filled it with the rotten vegetable scraps. He sprinkled ash on top. Ash contains potassium and calcium. It reduces acidity. It neutralizes salts. It creates an environment in which bacteria can live. Then he did something that would have made any local priest faint. He urinated right onto his plot. Urine is nitrogen, urea, the most accessible fertilizer in human history. Even the Sumerians knew this. Ha Min knew this from his textbooks. He sprinkled everything with a thin layer of dry soil and sat down nearby. The sun was setting. The second small blue moon was already hanging above the horizon. It was cold. There was nothing to eat, nothing to shelter under. But Ha Min looked at his square meter and saw not gray dust. He saw a process. Bacteria from the decaying organic matter would begin to multiply. The ash would lower the acidity by 1.5 points. Nitrogen from the urea would trigger the first cycle of mineralization. In a week, a thin layer of something resembling soil would appear in this hole. In 2 weeks, it would be ready for planting, if he could find any seeds. Ha Min lay down right on the ground next to his plot and closed his eyes. His back ached. The rib the guard had broken throbbed with every breath. His stomach was growling with hunger, but he was smiling, because for the first time in a very long time, he faced a task he knew he could definitely accomplish. The morning began with Ha Min scouting the surrounding area. He was looking for 3 things: water, seeds, and any material for mulch. He found water in a stream half an hour's walk west toward the forest. The stream was shallow and murky, but it was water. He hauled it back in a bucket he'd traded for yesterday. The seeds were trickier. In the forest, he found wild millet, thin panicles with small grains. Not ideal, but it'll do for the first cycle. Millet is hardy. It grows quickly. It doesn't demand much from the soil. Just what he needed to get started. He gathered mulch from dry grass at the edge of the forest and the plain. He brought back an armful and spread it in a thin layer around the planting hole. Mulch retains moisture. It prevents the sun from scorching the topsoil. It creates shade for microorganisms. For 3 days, he walked back and forth between the forest and his 1-meter plot. He carried water, he gathered organic matter. He added new batches of rotten vegetables and ash to the hole. On the 4th day, he noticed that the soil in the hole had changed color. It was gray like cement. It had become slightly darker, slightly softer to the touch. It was almost imperceptible, but Ha Min noticed. He'd been working with soil for 15 years. He'd seen changes like this before. It meant the process had begun. The bacteria had started working. On the 7th day, he planted 3 millet seeds in the center of the hole. Not too deep, about 1.5 fingers deep. He watered them. He covered them with mulch, and he waited. Waiting was second nature to Ha Min. In Mongolia, he'd wait 3 weeks for seedlings to emerge. Here, he didn't know how long to wait. The soil was poorer than Mongolia's, but he'd added more organic matter, and water was closer. On the 10th day, a stalk emerged from the ground. Just one, thin, crooked, pale green, so fragile it seemed it would snap at the slightest touch. Ha Min knelt before it, not moving. He looked at that stem as if it were a miracle, not because he was a scientist and knew this was normal, but because this stem was growing where nothing had grown for 100 years, where everyone had said nothing could grow, where the land had been declared dead and cursed, and yet it had sprouted. He tended to that stalk as if it were a child. He watered it twice a day. He sprinkled ash on it. He shielded it from the wind with a wall of stones. He talked to it, not because he believed plants could hear, but because there was no one else to talk to. On the 20th day, the stalk produced a small panicle, a tiny one, with 7 grains. Ha Min waited for the grains to ripen and carefully cut off the ear. 7 grains of millet, the first harvest from the dead land. He placed them in the palm of his hand and looked at the white rope around his plot. And then something happened that he hadn't expected. The rope twitched. Not from the wind. There was no wind. It twitched on its own. Then it slowly crept outward, pushing aside the gray dust and expanding the square. Ha Min watched, holding his breath. The rope stopped. Now his plot was 2 square meters, exactly twice as large. Ha Min sat there and watched it for about 20 minutes. Then he said quietly into the void, "So in 40 cycles I'll have a province. In 50, a kingdom. Got it. Let's get to work." He gathered 7 grains in a rag and hid them in his bosom. Then he looked at the 2 square meters of dead earth, one of which was already slightly darker, slightly more alive, and he began to dig a second hole. 2 square meters isn't a field. It isn't even a garden bed. It's a patch of land where a grown man can lie down fully stretched out without sticking out over the edge. But for Ha Min, it was progress. The doubling had been confirmed. The law worked. Now he needed to turn the theory into a system. He spent the first 3 days after the doubling preparing the new square meter. Same procedure. A hole, organic matter, ash, nitrogen, mulch. Only now he worked more intelligently. In the first meter, the soil was already alive, dark and soft, with some tiny creatures wriggling about in it. Not worms yet, but something resembling larvae. Ha Min transferred a handful of this living soil to the second meter. Inoculation. Seeding the new plot with bacteria and microorganisms from the one already in use. In the lab, he'd done this with special preparations. Here, he made do with what was available. While the second meter was settling, Ha Min solved the problem of food. He went into the forest every morning. He gathered roots, wild onions, mushrooms, and nuts. Not everything was familiar to him, but he proceeded cautiously. He'd try a small piece. He'd wait an hour. If his stomach didn't hurt, he'd eat some more. That's how, over the course of a week, he mapped out in his head what was edible. 4 types of roots, 2 types of mushrooms, nuts from a tree that looked like a chestnut tree. It was enough to keep him from dying. It wasn't enough to keep him from thinking about food all the time. On the 5th day after the soil had doubled in fertility, he planted both meters. On the 1st, he planted millet again. On the 2nd, he tried some wild peas he'd found by the stream. Peas are legumes. Legumes fix nitrogen from the air through nodule-forming bacteria on their roots. This means that after the peas, the soil will become richer. This is called crop rotation. It's a very simple principle that's 3,000 years old, and one that the local farmers apparently didn't know. They planted rice in the same field year after year and wondered why the harvest was declining. Ha Min saw this in the fields around the village of To Chong when he went to fetch water. The depleted soil, yellow, stunted shoots. No crop rotation, no rest for the soil, no fertilizer except prayers. He could have gone and told them, but he didn't. Not out of greed, out of caution. He is an outcast. The brand on his hand means that anyone can strike him, and the law will be on the striker's side. If he goes to the village and starts teaching the peasants how to live, at best they'll beat him. At worst, they'll kill him. As long as his land is just 2 meters, he's nobody. He needs to grow. 12 days later, the peas produced pods, small, tough, but real. Ha Min harvested both meters, millet and peas. The rope gave way and crept forward. 4 square meters. Ha Min allowed himself to eat half the peas. He set the rest aside for seed. He divided the millet as well. 1/3 for food, 2/3 for planting. Hunger was a constant companion. Dull, familiar. He'd learned to ignore it. For the next cycle, he planted all 4 meters differently. 1 meter of millet, 1 meter of peas, 1 meter of wild radish from seeds found by the roadside. He left the 4th meter for a compost pile. The compost bin is the heart of any farm. Ha Min found 2 flat stones near the forest and used them and some sticks to build a sort of box. Everything went in there. Peelings, greens, grass, leaves, and manure from the wild goats that grazed by the stream. He mixed it all together. He turned it over with a stick every 3 days. He kept an eye on the moisture level. In a month, he'd have real compost. Dark, rich, smelling of forest soil. In the 3rd week of the 3rd cycle, a woman came to his plot. Ha Min didn't notice her right away. He was kneeling, using his fingers to check the moisture level of the soil around the radish sprouts. He looked up and saw a girl of about 24, thin, in tattered clothes, with a knapsack slung over her shoulder. She stood behind the rope and looked at his garden beds. Not at him, at the garden beds. Her eyes were strange, not surprised, not frightened, eager. That's how a person looks who has spent their whole life searching for something and has finally found it. Ha Min asked what she wanted. She didn't answer. She crouched down and reached out toward a pea sprout. She didn't touch it. She just held her palm close to it. Then she said it was healthy. The sprout. She said that this sprout was healthy. Ha Min asked how she knew. She replied that she could feel it. She'd always been able to feel it. That's why they'd driven her out of the village. They said she was a witch. Her name was Cho Na Yun, a herbalist, or as they said in Tochon, a witch. She knew every plant in this forest. She knew which root cures a fever, which leaf stops bleeding, which mushroom is edible, and which one kills you in 3 hours. She knew all this not from books but from observation, from touch, from smells. But she didn't know why. She didn't know the mechanisms. She didn't know about photosynthesis, cell division, the capillary effect, or osmotic pressure. She knew what worked, but she didn't know how. Ha Min looked at her and saw a self-taught botanist with 30 years of field experience. Not a single day of formal education, but with an intuition that no amount of money could buy. He asked if she'd been kicked out for good. She nodded. He asked if she had anywhere to go. She shook her head. He pointed to the compost pile and said that if she helped him turn it every 3 days, she could live nearby. There wasn't much food, but the peas would be ready in 2 weeks. Na-young looked at the compost pile, then at him, then back at the peas. She sat down next to him and silently began pulling weeds around the sprouts. Ha Min didn't explain to her that he'd left some of those weeds there on purpose. He'd tell her later. For now, the main thing was that she'd stayed. She was the first person in a month who hadn't thrown a stone at him. Working together turned out to be 3 times faster. Not because Na-young was stronger, but because she knew the area. She showed him 3 water sources he hadn't even suspected existed. One was closer to the plot than the stream. She led him to a spot where wild clover was growing. Clover. Ha Min almost hugged her when he saw it. Clover is the best green manure in the world, the best nitrogen fixer, the best way to revitalize the soil. He ran back to the plot with a bunch of clover and planted it in a new square meter. Na-young asked why he needed a weed. Ha Min said it wasn't a weed but the most important plant in this field. She looked skeptical but said nothing. A week later, the clover had spread and the soil around it had noticeably darkened. Na-young touched it and said the soil had become softer. Ha Min explained why. The bacteria on the clover's roots take nitrogen directly from the air and release it into the soil. It's as if the plant itself were fertilizing the soil around it. Na-young was silent for a very long time. Then she asked if that meant any legume did the same thing. Ha Min nodded. Na-young stood up and left. 2 hours later, she returned with an armful of wild lupin and 2 types of vetch that Ha Min had never seen before. She knew where they grew. She had always known. She just didn't know why they were needed. Now she knew. The 4th cycle went by faster. 8 square meters. Na-young saw the rope creeping toward her and took a step. Her face was pale. She asked what kind of magic this was. Ha Min replied that he didn't know. Maybe a law. Maybe a contract. Maybe the earth was simply showing its gratitude. Na-young looked at him intently and said that there was a line in the old songs. Whoever feeds the dead will receive the living. Ha Min asked her to repeat it. She repeated it. He memorized it. 16 square meters by the end of the 5th cycle. A month and a half since he'd awakened. The plot was still tiny. But now millet, peas, radishes, and clover were growing there. The soil had turned from gray to dark brown. Earthworms lived in it. Real, living earthworms. Ha Min found the first one and held it in the palm of his hand as carefully as if it were a diamond. Because to an agronomist, an earthworm is more valuable than any diamond. An earthworm means aeration. It means organic matter is being broken down. It means 1,000 microchannels for water and air. It means life. Ha Min built a shelter out of branches and grass. Nearby, he constructed a drying shed. Under the shed, he hung bundles of herbs that Na-young had gathered in the forest. Near the shelter, he dug 2 stones into the ground to serve as a table. On the table lay a sheet of bark, on which he used a stick to record his observations. Approximate air temperature, amount of precipitation, days from sowing to emergence. Days from emergence to harvest, grain yield per meter. He measured everything he could, because agronomy isn't magic, it's data. In the evening, he sat by the campfire eating millet porridge. Yan sat next to him, sorting through wild pea seeds. She was selecting the largest ones. Ha Min asked why. She replied that large seeds produce strong sprouts. Ha Min smiled. She had just described the basic principle of plant breeding and hadn't even realized it. He told her she was right, and that if she did this every cycle, in 10 generations the peas would be twice as large. Na-young looked up at him with a look that was eager, hungry for knowledge. She asked what else he knew. Ha Min replied that he knew enough to feed everyone she had ever seen. Na-young turned away toward the fire and was silent for a long time. Then she said very quietly that her mother had died because they wouldn't let her gather the herbs she needed. The villagers had trampled the clearing where the gentian grew and said it was a witch's weed. Her mother had coughed for 2 weeks and then stopped. Ha Min didn't know what to say. Silently, he took a bundle of some kind of herb from the shed and placed it in front of her. It wasn't gentian. He didn't know what gentian was in this world, but it was a gesture, the only one he knew how to make. Na-yeon took the bundle and pressed it to her chest. They sat in silence until the fire burned out. In the morning, Ha Min got up and looked at his 16 meters. Dark, living soil with green sprouts. 2 months ago, there had been a gray square the size of a stool here. Now there was a garden bed. A small garden bed where 4 kinds of plants were growing. A hut stood nearby. A second person was sleeping in the hut. Compost was drying next to the hut. Herbs hung from the awning. It wasn't much, but it was a start. 32 square meters. The 6th cycle. 2.5 months in this world. Ha Min's plot was now the size of a large room. By the standards of the Hwachon Empire, it was still a tiny patch of land. By Ha Min's standards, it was a field for serious work. He divided it into 5 zones. The first for millet, the second for peas and vetch, the third for radishes and wild onions, the fourth for clover as a green manure crop, the fifth for the compost bin, which now occupied a full 4 square meters and produced real black compost. Dark, rich, smelling like the forest after rain. Na-yeon had learned to determine whether the compost was ready by touch. You squeeze it in your fist. If it holds its shape but doesn't drip, it's ready. Ha Min showed her this once. She remembered it forever. The problem was the tools. Ha Min dug with a stick. He loosened the soil with a rock. He weeded by hand. For 2 meters, that's tolerable. For 32, it's agonizing. His back ached so much that by evening he couldn't straighten up. His fingers were worn down to bloody calluses. He needed a real tool, a shovel, a hoe, anything made of metal. But the outcast didn't have a single coin. He had nothing to trade. Everything he grew went toward food and seeds. The solution came by chance. Na-yeon found an abandoned hunting trail in the forest. The trail led to an old trap, rusty, broken, and useless for hunting, but it was made of metal. Ha Min took the trap and thought it over. The metal needed to be reforged. That meant he needed a blacksmith. There was a blacksmith in the village of Thochon, an old man named Beck, but he wouldn't go to the outcast, nor would he let the outcast into his workshop. So Ha Min did what he did best. He grew something. From the new radish harvest, he selected 3, the largest ones, the smoothest ones, with a nice color. He carried them to the village. There were no guards at the entrance. The village wasn't guarded. It was just that no one spoke to him. He placed the 3 radishes on the threshold of blacksmith Beck's house and left. The next day, he came back. He placed 3 more. On the 3rd day, the blacksmith came out, an old man, hunchbacked, with hands like pincers. He looked at the radish. He looked at Ha Min. He asked what he wanted. Ha Min showed him the broken trap and explained that he needed a hoe, a small one, a light one, with a curved handle because his back hurts. Blacksmith Peck grunted. Then he picked up the trap. Then he picked up the radish. He told him to come back in 3 days. 3 days later, Ha Min received the hoe. Rough, a bit heavy, but made of real metal. He worked with it all day, and by evening he had dug up the entire plot. In a single day, he did a week's worth of work. That evening, he went to Blacksmith Pack and said that the hoe was good, but heavy, and that the blade was too wide for loosening the soil between the rows. The blacksmith looked at him as if he were a man trying to teach a fish to swim. He asked how an outcast knew anything about tools. Ha Min replied that he had read a lot. The blacksmith snorted and said that his daughter had read a lot too, and it hadn't done her any good. Ha Min remembered that remark. A week later, he learned about the blacksmith's daughter, Baek Soo-jin, 22 years old, a female blacksmith who had inherited not her father's workshop, but only his skill. She had opened her own workshop in the town of Cheonsu, a 2-day journey from here, and she'd nearly gone bankrupt because nobody wanted good tools. Everyone bought cheap imperial junk, mass-produced by the thousands in government-run factories. The quality was terrible, but it was cheap, and what Soo-jin made was expensive because it was good. She returned to her father a month ago, angry, broken, with burned hands and an empty wallet. Ha Min met her on the 7th day after receiving the hoe. He'd come to the blacksmith for advice on how to sharpen the blade to make it thinner. The door was opened by a girl with rolled-up sleeves and burn marks on her forearms. She looked at the brand on his arm and told him to get lost. Ha Min didn't leave. He showed her the hoe. He said the work was excellent, but he'd like to discuss a few modifications. Soo-jin looked at the hoe, then at him, then back at the hoe. She asked what modifications he had in mind. Ha Min took out his piece of bark, on which he'd scratched a sketch with a stick. A hoe with a narrow blade for weeding. A sickle with fine teeth for cutting stems without damaging the roots. A lightweight plow for 1 person. No draft animals required. With an angled handle so that the downward pressure comes from body weight rather than arm strength. Soo-jin looked at the sketch for a long time. Then she said it was nonsense. A plow without an ox doesn't work. Ha Min asked if she'd tried it. Sujin remained silent. Ha Min said that if she made this plow and it didn't work, he'd bring her a month's supply of radishes and peas for free. If it worked, she'd come take a look at his plot. Sujin rolled her eyes. Then she took the bark with the drawing on it. She told him to come back in 5 days. 5 days later, she came on her own. Not him to her, but she to him. She brought the plow. It was light, made from an old, reforged plowshare, with the handle at an angle, just as he'd drawn it. She tossed it at the edge of the plot and said she wanted to see how this nonsense worked. Ha Min picked up the plow and stepped out a meter. He thrust the blade into the ground. He pressed down with all his weight. The blade sank in. He pulled it toward him. The earth parted into a smooth furrow, easily, cleanly, without tearing. With just one hand, he could plow a furrow across the entire plot. Sujin watched. Ha Min turned around and saw her face. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. She looked the way a master looks at something that turned out just right, with a quiet pride that made her eyes sparkle. Ha Min said it was the best tool he'd ever held. Sujin blushed to her ears and muttered that he was flattering her. Then she looked out at the plot, at the green rows, at the compost bin, at the shed, at Na Yun, who was at the other end of the plot, tying peas to stakes. She asked how he'd done it, how he'd brought the dead soil back to life. Ha Min answered, simply, in detail, no secrets. He explained about compost and bacteria and nitrogen fixation and crop rotation. Sujin listened in silence. When he finished, she asked why he was telling her all this. He could have kept it a secret and sold it. Ha Min shrugged and said that the soil isn't a secret. It's alive. It's silly to keep something alive a secret. Sujin looked at him very strangely. Then she left. 3 days later, she returned with a bag of tools, 2 sickles, 3 pruning knives, a new hoe, lighter than the first one, a set of bamboo tubes of various diameters. Ha Min asked how much they cost. Sujin said they were free. She said she wanted to see what he would use them for. It was more interesting than forging horseshoes. She didn't stay that day. She went back to her father. But she started coming every 3 days. She brought tools. She watched Ha Min work. She scolded him for holding the sickle wrong. She said the hoe needed to be sharpened more often, that he was cutting the bamboo tubes crookedly and they'd leak. Then she'd silently take the tubes and cut them straight. Ha Min worked in silence. Na Yun worked in silence. Sujin scolded them both and made everything better. By the 9th week, Ha Min had harvested his 7th crop, 64 square meters, almost a quarter of a chan. It was already noticeable. Not just a spot on the plain, but a real green rectangle in the middle of the gray. It was visible from the road. It was a mistake and, at the same time, inevitable. Greenery on barren land is visible from afar. The first to notice it was a merchant from a caravan. He stopped his wagon on the road and stared at the green patch. Then he drove on. 3 days later, the village headman arrived from the village of Tochan. A short, fat man with oily eyes. He stood at the edge of the plot and asked who had allowed the outcasts to grow crops on the cursed land. Ha Min replied that he had been given this plot for life. The sign says so. The village head looked at the sign. He looked at the greenery. He looked at Ha Min. He said that cursed land should not bear fruit. If it did, it meant the outcast was practicing witchcraft. And in the empire, witchcraft is punishable by death. Ha Min asked if there was a law against growing radishes. The village head didn't know what to say. He left. But Ha Min saw his eyes. There was no fear of sorcery there. There was greed. 64 meters of fertile soil out of nothing. For the village head of a village where the land was depleted, it was like discovering a gold vein. Ha Min told Na Yun that trouble was coming soon. She nodded. She already knew. People don't like it when an outcast succeeds. That evening, Ha Min sat by the fire and did the math. 64 meters. The next doubling would be 128, then 256. That's already a quarter of a chan, the size of a poor peasant's plot. 5 cycles after that, he'll surpass the headman of Tochan, who owns 2 chan. In 10 cycles, he'll surpass the local district baron. Problems will come before the land does. He needs to be ready. He needs people. We need walls. We need connections. Or at least one person who knows how to count and negotiate. Because Ha Min knew how to count only grains. He knew almost nothing about dealing with people. He lay down and looked at the 2 moons, the yellow one and the blue one. Somewhere in the darkness, Na Yun was singing softly. A song without words. A melody her mother had probably sung to her. Ha Min closed his eyes and thought that tomorrow he'd need to set up a new compost bin for the next round of doubling, and that he should try planting rice if he could find the seeds. Rice is on another level. Rice isn't just food. In the Huachan Empire, rice is currency. Whoever grows rice grows power. Trouble came sooner than Ha Min had expected. On the 3rd day after the village head's visit, 4 men from Tochan arrived at the plot. They were burly, with sticks. The village head stood behind them, watching from a distance. The men didn't introduce themselves. The leader said that the outcast had to get off that cursed land because it belonged to the village. Ha Min pointed to the sign. His name, his plot, for life. The leader spat on the sign and said that pieces of paper from the capital meant nothing here. Ha Min realized that talking was useless. He stood silently at the edge of the plot. Yeon stood behind him, a pruning knife in her hand. The four men exchanged glances. The law allowed them to beat the outcast. No one forbade beating a woman either, but something was holding them back. Maybe it was the greenery on that cursed land. Maybe it was the silence with which Ha Min was watching them. They shuffled their feet and left. They promised to return. Ha Min knew they would return. And next time, they wouldn't stop at sticks. He needed protection, not military protection, legal protection. In the Hwachon Empire, even an exile had the right to his own plot of land. The problem was that you had to know how to assert those rights, and Ha Min didn't know the local laws. He didn't know who to turn to. He didn't know how the system worked. The solution came the next day, from an unexpected source. Ha Min went to the stream to water, and on his way back, he saw a woman on the road. She was sitting by the side of the road, staring into space. A sack lay nearby. Her clothes were of good quality, not peasant attire. The fabric was fine. The cut was simple yet elegant. But they were dirty and torn, as if she'd been walking for several days without stopping. Ha Min walked past her. Then he stopped. He turned back. He asked if everything was all right. The woman raised her head. She was about 28 years old. Her face was angular. Her eyes were intelligent, yet empty. The eyes of someone who had lost everything and hadn't yet decided whether to go on living or not. She asked how far it was to the nearest town. Ha Min said that Thochon wasn't a town but a village, and it was an hour's walk away. She asked if there was an inn there. Ha Min said no. She nodded. She was silent for a moment. Then she asked what the green patch off to the side of the road was. Ha Min said it was his plot of land. She looked at the brand on his arm, then at the greenery in the distance, then back at the brand. She asked how an outcast had managed to grow anything on dead soil. Ha Min shrugged and said the soil wasn't dead, just hungry. The woman stood up. She picked up the sack. She said she wanted to take a look. Her name was Oh Se-ah. She was the former junior manager of the Han House, one of the great houses of the empire. She counted money. She kept track of grain. She managed logistics for 3 provinces. She was 28 years old and the best at her job. And then House Han decided that the O family knew too much. Her parents were quietly killed. An accident at the warehouse. A collapsed roof. Her brother was arrested on false charges. Se-ah fled with a single bag containing 3 notebooks full of records and an abacus, counting beads, her weapon. She had been walking for a week. She hadn't eaten for 2 days. She didn't know where she was going. She just kept walking. Ha Min led her to the compound. Yeon silently poured her a bowl of pea porridge. Se-ah ate slowly, neatly. Even as she was starving to death, she ate carefully. Then she set down the bowl and scanned the plot. 64 square meters, 5 zones, a compost bin, a shack, a shed, 2 people. She asked what his annual income was. Ha Min didn't understand the question. Se-ah clarified. How much does he harvest per cycle? How much goes toward food? How much towards seeds? How much is left over? Ha Min gave a rough estimate. Se-ah took a notebook and an abacus out of her bag. She did the math. 5 minutes later, she looked up and said that, given his current yield and rate of doubling, in 4 cycles he'd have enough surplus to sell. In 8, he'd be able to hire workers. In 12, he could buy a letter of protection from the county official. Ha Min listened, and for the first time in 2.5 months, felt as though someone was speaking his language. Not the language of plants, but the language of systems. He asked what a protective charter was. Se-ah explained. In the Hwachon Empire, any landowner with more than 1 chon can purchase a document from a local official confirming his rights. With this document, the village headman won't be able to do anything. Without it, Ha Min is defenseless. 1 chon is a quarter of a hectare. Ha Min has 64 meters. It takes 4 doublings to reach 1 chon. A month, maybe a month and a half, if nothing happens. Se-ah asked if she could stay. Ha Min asked what she could do. Se-ah replied that she could count, and that counting is the first thing someone needs if they want to survive among people who are better at it than they are. Ha Min thought for a moment, then he nodded. On her very first day, Se-ah reorganized their household. She recounted all their supplies, every grain of millet, every pea pod, every radish, and divided them into 3 portions. Food for the week, seeds for the next growing cycle, a reserve in case of failure. Ha Min used to divide things by eye. Seiya divided them by weight, by number, by the calories she estimated in her head. She started keeping track of water. How many buckets a day? How much for watering? How much for drinking? How much for washing? It turned out that Ha Min was using 3 times more water for irrigation than necessary. He watered generously, as he was accustomed to doing in Mongolia, where water evaporated instantly. Here, the climate was milder, more humid. It was possible to water less frequently and use less water. Saving water meant saving time, and time meant a harvest. A week after Seiya's arrival, Sujin showed up at the plot, not with tools, but with news. She said people in Tochon were talking about Ha Min, not just in Tochon. A merchant from a caravan had told the market in Cheongsu about the greenery growing on barren land. Now everyone knew about it, and that was bad, because the land near Tochon belonged to Baron So. Not that So, the younger brother of the head of the House of So, a minor noble with 300 chon and a nasty temper. If the Baron finds out that someone is growing crops on the cursed land in his district, he'll come, and not with sticks, but with soldiers. Ha Min asked when. Sujin said maybe in a week, maybe in 2. The Baron lives in Sohyeon Castle, half a day's journey away. When the news reaches him depends on how fast rumors spread. Ha Min looked at Seiya. Seiya had already done the math. A minute later, she said they needed 1 John. It takes 4 cycles to complete 1 John. Each cycle lasts 8 to 10 days. A month. They need a month. If the Baron comes in 2 weeks, they won't make it in time. So they need to speed things up. Ha Min thought for a moment. Then he went to the field. He knew of one way, a risky one. If he planted the entire plot with a fast-growing crop and harvested everything at once, he could cut the cycle in half. The problem was that it would deplete the soil. All the compost he'd been saving for months would be used up in a single harvest. But right now, time was more important than the soil. Soil can be restored, freedom cannot. He planted all 64 meters with radishes, the fastest growing crop he had. They sprout in 3 days and are ready in 12. Instead of 5 separate sections, he made one continuous plot. He spread the compost throughout the entire plot and watered it twice a day. Yun helped with the watering. Seiya kept track of the water and seed usage. Sujin came every evening and brought news from Tochon. On the 4th day, Sujin said the Baron already knew. The merchant had spread the word not only at the market, but also at the tavern where the Baron's men drank. On the 6th day, 2 horsemen rode past the plot. They didn't stop. They just took a look and rode off towards Sohan. Reconnaissance. On the 8th day, the radishes were ready. Not all of it. 80%. Ha Min didn't wait for the remaining 20%. He harvested everything, every single root. Yun and Seiya helped. They pulled them out of the ground and piled them up. They worked until dark by the light of the campfire. In the morning, Ha Min stood over the pile of radishes and looked at the rope. The rope didn't move. Ha Min felt a chill. He'd harvested the entire crop. The rope hadn't budged. Why? He sat down and began to think. The rule. Every time a full harvest is gathered from his land, the boundaries double. A full harvest. 20% wasn't ripe yet. He had removed the unripe roots. The harvest wasn't a full harvest. He clutched his head. 3 days. He needed 3 more days for the remaining radishes to ripen. The Baron might arrive in 3 days. Ha Min ordered Nayeon to keep watering. He ordered Seiya to count the stock for the auction. He ordered Sujin to keep watch on the road. He himself lay down next to the garden bed and didn't sleep all night. He watered them in the morning. He watered them in the afternoon. He watered them in the evening. On the 2nd day, the leaves began to turn yellow, a sign of ripeness. On the morning of the 3rd day, he pulled up a radish, full-sized, ripe. He harvested them all, every root vegetable, down to the last one. He piled them up. The rope gave way. It crept forward. 128 square meters. Ha Min exhaled. He planted again. 10 days later, he harvested. 256 meters. The rope crept forward. He planted. He harvested. 512. One more time. 1,024 square meters. 1 chon. A quarter of a hectare. 4 cycles in 26 days. An exhausting marathon that squeezed everything he'd put into the soil over 3 months right back out. The soil grew pale. It lost its fertility, but the boundaries remained. Seiya left for the county seat that very same day. She knew how to talk to officials. She knew what words to use, what documents to show, what bribes to offer. She took a sack of radishes with her because she had no money, but officials eat too. She returned 2 days later with a certificate, a scroll bearing the seal of the district governor, confirming that Yoon Ha Min was the rightful owner of 1 chon of land in the Tochon district. The stigma of exile did not revoke his right to the land. Imperial law was clear. The land was granted for life. Anyone who contested it would pay a fine 10 times its value. Baron So arrived the next day, with 4 soldiers, on horseback, dressed in fine clothes, with a contemptuous smile. He saw the green square where the barren land was supposed to be, and his smile widened. He dismounted. He approached Ha Min. He said he was impressed, and that he was ready to buy the plot for 100 coins, a generous offer for an outcast. Ha Min remained silent. Se-ah stepped forward. She showed him the charter. She cited the law number. She stated the amount of the fine for illegal appropriation. She delivered all this in an even, calm voice, just as she had when reading the report at the Han House Council. The Baron stopped smiling. He looked at the charter, at the seal, at Se-ah. He asked who she was. Se-ah replied that she was the steward of the Yoon estate. The Baron snorted. He turned around. He mounted his horse. He rode off. At the gate to the estate, he stopped and turned around. He said that the letters were burning. Ha Min heard him. He remembered. When the dust from the hooves settled, Se-ah calmly folded the letter and said that they had 3 months, maybe 4. Then the Baron would find a way to get around the law. By then, they'd need to be more than just 1 jong, much more, or find a patron, or both. Ha Min nodded. He looked at his plot, 1,000 square meters of barren but living land. 4 people if you count Sujin, a protective charter that's burning away, and somewhere on the horizon, the Baron and his soldiers, who will return. He picked up his hoe and went to set up a new compost bin. The soil wouldn't restore itself. After the Baron left, Ha Min didn't speak for 3 days. Not out of stubbornness, but out of concentration. The soil looked bad after the marathon doubling effort. It had turned gray. It was losing its structure. The compost he'd been adding for months had been drained by 4 consecutive radish cycles without rest or crop rotation. It was like withdrawing all his savings from the bank at once. Technically, the account was open, but it was empty. The first thing he did was sow 1/3 of the plot with clover and wild vetch. Not a single edible plant on that third, just green manure. Na-young asked if he'd lost his mind, wasting land on weeds when they needed to feed 4 people. Ha Min replied that the weeds would nourish the soil, and the soil would then nourish them. Na-young paused for a moment and went to gather wild lupine for the second plot. He planted the second third with peas and beans. He left the third third for millet and radishes to eat. Se-ah counted their supplies and said that at this rate, they'd have enough food for 3 weeks. After that, they'd either have to harvest or start selling. There was nothing to sell, so they'd have to harvest the crops. Ha Min worked from morning until dark. He dug, he loosened the soil, he weeded, he watered, he set up a new compost bin twice as big as the previous one. Yun brought organic matter from the forest, leaves, moss, rotten wood, anything that decomposes. Sujin brought new tools, a rake with short tines for loosening the topsoil, a trowel for transplanting, and a strange contraption she'd invented herself, a metal frame into which bamboo tubes were inserted at an angle. Ha Min looked at it and didn't immediately understand what it was. Then he realized, it is a primitive irrigation system. Water was poured into the top tube and dripped onto the garden bed through holes in the lower ones. Drip irrigation. Sujin didn't know that term. She'd just seen Ha Min hauling water in buckets and figured there had to be an easier way. Ha Min looked at her contraption and said nothing. Then he quietly said it was genius. Sujin blushed and called him a liar, but she kept the frame. Ha Min set up the system over the pea bed. He filled the top tube. Water began to drip. Evenly, slowly. Every drop went exactly where it was supposed to. Water usage was reduced by 2/3. Watering time went from 2 hours to 20 minutes. Ha Min spent the time he'd saved on what he'd been putting off since day 1, rice. He'd found wild rice in a backwater by the stream during the second week. He'd memorized the spot. But he hadn't touched it because rice requires prepared soil. Now the soil was ready. 1 chon. Plenty of room to work. He went to the backwater and gathered wild rice panicles. The grains were small, brown, nothing like the white rice they ate in the capital. But it was rice. Ha Min knew what he needed. Water. Lot of water. Stagnant. Warm. A rice paddy is essentially a shallow marsh with a controlled water level. To get the full effect, he needed a system of canals. On a single chon, it was doable. He grabbed a hoe and began digging a ditch from the stream to the plot. 200 meters. By hand. 1 man. In 1 day, he dug 20 meters. His back was on fire. His hands were shaking. His blisters burst and bled. On the second day, Na-yeon silently stood beside him and began digging. On the third day, Sujin arrived with a shovel she'd forged herself and said she couldn't bear to watch him suffer. By the end of the second week, the ditch was ready. Shallow, narrow, crooked. but the water flowed. Ha Min built a small paddy field on the plot, a 5 by 5 meter square surrounded by earthen banks. He filled it with water 2 fingers deep. He planted wild rice seedlings that he had germinated separately in a basket of wet moss. 20 sprouts, thin and fragile. He planted each one by hand, spacing them a palm's width apart. The rice grew more slowly than millet. That was to be expected. Wild rice is capricious. It hasn't been tamed by millennia of selective breeding like Japanese or Korean rice. But it grew. Green stalks poked out of the water like miniature bamboo shoots. Ha Min checked on them every morning. He felt the stalks. He examined the color of the leaves. He looked for signs of disease or nutrient deficiency. Yoon also checked on them. She did it differently. She didn't touch them but stood nearby and listened. Once, Ha Min asked what she could hear. She replied that she heard nothing, but she could feel it. The third one from the left wanted more sun. Ha Min checked. The third one from the left was indeed in the shade cast by the side of the container. He moved the side of the container. The sprout straightened up in 2 days. Ha Min stopped asking questions about her intuition and just listened. Alongside the rice project, he launched a project that Se-ah called Madness, biochar. In his past life, Ha Min had worked with biochar in Mongolia for 3 years. It's charred organic matter, wood, straw, or manure burned without access to air. Not ash, but actual charcoal. Porous, lightweight, with a huge surface area. It acts like a sponge for nutrients, absorbing them and slowly releasing them. In the modern world, it's produced in special kilns. Here, Ha Min had to get creative. He dug a pit, deep and narrow. He filled it with dry branches and straw. He set it on fire from above. When the fire blazed up, he covered the pit with earth, leaving a small opening for the smoke. The fire continued to burn inside, but without air, it couldn't burn the wood completely. Instead of ash, he ended up with charcoal, black, brittle. It crumbled in his hands into small, shiny pieces. Ha Min ground it with a stone and mixed it with compost. The ratio was about 1 to 3. He spread it over the garden beds. The effect became apparent after a week. The plants in the beds with biochar looked different, greener, stronger, thicker stems, wider leaves. The difference was visible to the naked eye. Yoon sat down by the bed with biochar and spent a long time touching the leaves. Then she moved to the bed without it, then back again. She said that the soil with the black powder sang louder. Ha Min didn't ask her to clarify what she meant. He knew that, in scientific terms, biochar increases the soil's cation exchange capacity. It retains water. It creates an environment for mycorrhizal fungi that live on plant roots and help them absorb nutrients from the soil. It's a symbiosis. The plant feeds the fungus with sugar. The fungus feeds the plant with minerals. Together they grow faster than they do separately. To Na Yoon, the earth sang. To Ha Min, the earth functioned as a biological system with positive feedback. They were talking about the same thing in different languages, and they were both right. By the end of the 4th month, Ha Min had harvested the entire chon. Peas, millet, radishes. The rice wasn't ready yet. He didn't remove the green manure crops. Instead, he tilled them directly into the soil. Green manure. The rope crept forward. 2 chon, half a hectare. Ha Min stood at the edge of his plot and looked at the green rectangle against the backdrop of the gray plain. 2 chon. That's more than village head Tochon has. The village head will find out about this. So will the baron. Se-ah stood nearby with a notebook. She said that at the current rate of doubling, in half a year they would have 16 chon. In a year, 64. That's the territory of a minor noble. In a year and a half, 256 chon. That's a baron's estate. Ha Min asked when the baron would start to get nervous. Se-ah replied that he already had. Because it wasn't about the size of the land. It was about the fact that food grew on that land. In an empire where millions were starving, the one who fed the people was more dangerous than the one who killed them. Ha Min nodded. He looked at the rice patch where 20 sprouts were slowly stretching upward. This rice would be ready in 2 months. Wild, small-grained, tasteless. But this was only the first generation. He had already picked out the 5 best sprouts by eye, the tallest, the thickest, with the darkest colored leaves. From them, he would take seeds for the 2nd generation. From the 2nd, for the 3rd. In 10 generations, the rice would be different, larger, more fragrant, more productive. He didn't yet know what he would name this variety, but he had time, and he had a plot that grew with each cycle. And there were 3 women who, for some inexplicable reason, decided that his crazy project was worth their time. And there was a 4th who came by every 3 days and scolded him for holding his tools the wrong way. In the evening, he sat by the fire. Na Yoon sorted through the seeds. Su-ah wrote in her notebook. Soo-jin sharpened a new sickle and grumbled that the whetstone was no good. Ha Min was cooking millet porridge. He added peas. He added wild onions. He added a pinch of salt that Se-ah had traded for radishes in Chochon. The porridge turned out hot and thick. It wasn't tasty by the standards of his past life, but here and now, it was the best dinner in the world. He divided it among 4 bowls, one for Na-yeon, one for Se-ah. He set one at the edge of the plot for Soo-jin, who was sitting off to the side and pretending she wasn't hungry, one for himself. They ate in silence. 2 moons hung overhead, one yellow, one blue. The first starlight fell upon 2 patches of living earth in the middle of a dead plain. Somewhere in the village of Chochon, peasants were eating tree bark because the harvest had failed again, and grain prices had skyrocketed due to the monopoly of the great houses. Somewhere in the capital, Emperor Li Gon was growing old and losing his grip on power. Somewhere in the south, the provinces were rebelling. Meanwhile, somewhere in Sohyeon Castle, Baron So was thinking about how to remove the outcast from the land that was never meant to come back to life. And Ha Min sat by the fire, thinking that tomorrow he needed to dig up the eastern sector and add compost mixed with biochar, and that in a week, the peas in the southern plot would be ready for harvest. And that the rice in the field looked healthy, and in 2 months he would harvest his first crop. And that the porridge had turned out well today, really well. He smiled quietly and finished his portion. There would be a lot of work tomorrow, but it was the right kind of work. Work that brings the land back to life and keeps people from going hungry. For that, it was worth dying on the highway near Canning and waking up with his face in the dust. 2 patches of living earth in the middle of a dead plain. 4 people, 1 rice voucher, 1 compost bin the size of a room, and a silence that deceived no one. Ha Min knew the Baron would return. The question wasn't whether he would come, but what he would bring with him. Se-ah had said the Baron had 2 options. The first was an accusation of witchcraft. For that, he'd need a priest to confirm that the land had come to life against the will of heaven. The second was military conscription. For that, he'd need a pretext, any pretext. Failure to pay taxes, an insult to a noble, a false accusation. The charter protected against direct seizure, but it didn't protect against someone willing to play dirty. Ha Min listened and worked. He didn't know how to scheme. He didn't know how to negotiate. He didn't know how to play other people's games. But he knew how to grow crops, and every new harvest made him a little stronger. A week after the doubling, he harvested the peas from the southern plot. The rope hadn't moved. Ha Min wasn't surprised. The rule required a full harvest from all the land. Peas from just one plot weren't a harvest, they were just a fraction. He had to bring everything to harvest. Millet on the western strip, radishes on the northern one, rice on the plot. Green manure crops didn't count because they weren't harvested, but turned into the soil. Ha Min calculated the timelines. The millet would be ready in 10 days, the radishes in 12, the rice in 6 weeks. The rice was holding everything up. Wild rice grew slowly and capriciously, but without it, the harvest wouldn't be complete. Ha Min decided to wait. For an agronomist, patience is not a virtue, but a working tool. While the rice was ripening, he set about the task he'd been putting off, building. The shelter made of branches was suitable for 1 person in the summer. For 4 people in the fall, it was useless. The nights grew colder. The wind from the mountains brought dampness. Yeon coughed in the mornings. Ha Min cut down 10 slender trees in the forest. He used the trunks as a frame. He filled the walls with clay mixed with straw. He covered the roof with 3 layers of bundles of dry grass. The result was a hut. It was small, low, but dry and warm. It had a door made of woven branches and a window covered with oiled cloth that Se-ah had traded for at the market. Inside, there was room for 4 sleeping platforms made of dry grass and a stone hearth. Soo-jin looked at the hut and said she'd seen sheds built better than this. Ha Min agreed. But sheds were built by carpenters, and he was an agronomist. Soo-jin snorted and walked away. 2 days later, she returned with metal door hinges and brackets for the frame. She said that if they were going to live in a shed, at least the roof shouldn't blow away at the first storm. Ha Min reinforced the frame. The roof didn't blow away. The rice ripened by the middle of the 5th month. 20 panicles, small, brown, unremarkable. Ha Min cut them down one by one and laid them out on a rock to dry. The grains were small, tough, but it was rice. The first rice grown on land that everyone considered cursed. He pounded the grains with a stone. He boiled a handful. He tasted it. Tough, tasteless, bland. Completely ordinary wild rice that wouldn't impress anyone. But Na-yeon tasted it and froze. Then she said she had never eaten rice before. She had only heard of it. In the village of Chochon, rice was a luxury. The peasants ate millet porridge, sometimes barley. Rice was bought by the great houses and the capital's nobility. Ordinary people only saw it on holidays. Ha Min looked at her, then at Se-ah, who was eating the rice neatly and in silence. For her, rice was an ordinary food from her past life in the Han house. For Na-yeon, it was a revelation. Ha Min made a mental note. Rice here isn't just food, rice is status, power. If he could grow enough rice to trade, it would change everything. But first, he needed a variety better than the wild one. He selected the 5 best panicles from 20, the fullest, the heaviest. He set the grains from them aside separately. The rest he used for food and for planting. He'll plant the second generation more densely, on a larger plot, with plenty of water. He'll begin crossbreeding the lines, selecting based on 3 traits: grain size, maturation speed, cold hardiness. In 10 generations, he'll have a variety the world has never seen. In 20, he'll be feeding the province. With the rice in hand, he finally harvested a full crop from the entire plot. Millet, peas, radishes, rice. The rope crept along, 4 chon, a whole hectare tar. Ha Min stood at the edge, unable to take in the full extent of his land. 4 months ago, there had been a square the size of a stool here. Now there was a field. A real field where one could work, not just survive. And people took notice. First, a boy from Tochen came, the very same one who'd thrown stones on the first day. He stood by the rope and looked at the greenery. Ha Min didn't chase him away. He gave him a pot of peas. The boy ate it and ran off. The next day he came with his mother. His mother was thin, withered, with lifeless eyes. She asked if it was true that the outcast was growing food on barren land. Ha Min showed her the garden beds. The woman stood there and looked. Then she asked if she could buy some peas for her children. She had 3. The youngest was 2 years old. He'd been eating tree bark for a month because grain prices had tripled in half a year. House So had bought up all the rice in the province. Prices at the market were so high that a peasant family spent everything they had on a single measure of grain per week. Ha Min gave her the peas for free, a full bowl. The woman began to cry. He turned away because he didn't know what to do when people cried. Se-ah saw this and said that evening that he couldn't feed the village for free. Their supplies wouldn't last. Ha Min replied that he knew. But a 2-year-old child was eating tree bark. Se-ah was silent for a moment. Then she said they needed to set up a system. Not to give things away, but to exchange them, peas and radishes for labor. The peasants would work on the plot and receive food in return. That way, both production and the labor force would increase. Ha Min agreed. It was the right thing to do. A week later, 5 people from Tochen were working on the plot. 3 women and 2 elderly men. They dug. They carried water. They pulled weeds. In return, they received food. Peas, radishes, and millet. Not much, but better than nothing. Yeon taught them to distinguish between weeds and crops. Se-ah kept track of the hours worked and the rations distributed. Everything was recorded. Everything was accounted for. Ha Min watched the people working on his land and thought that this was the beginning. Not just a farm, a community. But it also meant something else. More people meant more attention. More attention meant more problems. And the problem arrived in the form of a priest. His name was Wang De-sik, a junior priest at the Temple of Heavenly Ashes. Plump, greasy, with a beard as thin as a mouse's tail. He appeared on the plot accompanied by 2 novices and with an expression that was meant to convey sacred sorrow. He declared that the land had come to life not by the will of heaven, and that this was a violation of the divine order. Dead land is dead because the gods have decreed it so. Whoever revives it goes against the will of heaven. This is heresy. Heresy is punishable by excommunication from the community and confiscation of property. Ha Min listened in silence. When the priest finished, Ha Min asked one question. Does the Holy Father bless the fields before sowing? The priest said, of course. It is a mandatory ritual. Ha Min asked what exactly he uses to bless them. The priest replied that he uses holy water from the temple spring. Ha Min nodded. Then he asked whether the Holy Father added the urine of the temple donkey to the holy water, as tradition dictates. The priest hesitated. Then he confirmed that yes, he did. It was an ancient rite of purification. Ha Min said that donkey urine has high acidity, and that fields blessed in this way lose their fertility more quickly. If the Holy Father wants to help the farmers, it would be better to bless them with plain water. Or better yet, water infused with ash. It lowers acidity and adds potassium. The priest stood there blinking. The novices behind him exchanged glances. One of the farmers working on the plot snorted, stifling a laugh. The priest flushed and said that was blasphemy. Ha Min shrugged and replied that it was agronomy. The priest left, promising to return with an order from the abbot. Se-ah watched him go and whispered that Ha Ming had just made an enemy worse than the Baron. The Baron wants his land. The priest wants his silence. And anyone who wants to silence you is more dangerous than someone who wants your property. Ha Ming knew she was right, but he couldn't help himself. 15 years of a scientific career had taught him to call things by their proper names. A donkey's urine isn't holy water. It's a source of ammonia. And to remain silent about it meant allowing people to continue destroying their own land. That evening, he sat with Na-yeon by the rice paddy. The second-generation sprouts were already standing in the water, stronger than the first, taller, with darker leaves. The selection process was working even at such an early stage. Na-yeon asked why he was arguing with the priest. She said that priests were dangerous. Her mother had also argued with a priest, a village priest. She said that herbs healed just as well as prayers. The priest declared her a witch. After that, the villagers stopped letting her gather herbs. Her mother died. Ha Min listened in silence. Then he said he understood. But if he remained silent while people were killing their soil with sacred urine, then what was the point of him even being here? Na-yeon didn't answer. But in the morning, he found a bundle of dried herbs tied with string next to his sleeping mat. Gentian. She had found gentian, the very herb that could have saved her mother. She found it in a remote corner of the forest, a 2-hour walk away. She brought it and placed it there for him, not for herself, but for him. Ha Min held the bundle, unsure what to do with it. Then he realized, it wasn't a gift, it was a sign of trust. She had given him the most precious thing she possessed, the memory of her mother, and the pain that memory carried. He stepped out of the hut and planted the gentian in a corner of the plot, separate from everything else. In a small garden bed, 3 by 3 steps, he watered it. He covered it with compost. When he turned around, Na-yeon was standing in the doorway, watching. Her eyes were wet. She didn't say a word. He didn't say anything either. She went to water the peas. He went to loosen the millet. The day went on as usual, but the small bed with the gentian remained, and something between them had shifted. Not with words, with actions. In a way only he knew how. 8 chon. 2 hectares. His 6th month in this world. Ha Min looked out at his field from the hill and thought about how scale changes everything. On a single chon, he could keep track of every sprout. On 8, it was impossible. He needed a system. He needed people. He needed organization. Se-ah was already working on it. She had divided the plot into sectors, each sector for a single crop. Millet, peas, radishes, rice, clover for green manure, composting area, unallocated reserve for expansion. She assigned a number to each sector and created a separate page in her notebook for it. Resource input, crop yield, work hours, losses. She kept track of everything. Ha Min gave her complete freedom to manage the plot and never once regretted it. The number of farmers on the plot grew to 12, then 15, then 20. They came from Tochon and 2 neighboring villages. Word spread. Food is growing on barren land. The outcast is feeding people. Go to the outcast. Not everyone came to work. Some came just to watch. They stood by the rope and gazed at the green rose. They touched the soil with their hands. They sniffed it. One old man came and knelt down in front of the garden bed. He stood there for about 5 minutes. Then he whispered that it was alive, that the earth was alive. Ha Min didn't hear this. Na-yeon heard it and told him that evening. Ha Min didn't say anything, but he remembered. The second-generation rice was growing well. 200 sprouts on the expanded plot. The grains were slightly larger than those of the first generation. The panicles were fuller. The stalks were more wind-resistant. Ha Min selected the best plants and marked them with bamboo sticks. A red stick meant large grains. Blue meant early ripening. Green meant a tall stalk. He kept records on the bark, transferring the data from each generation into a table. Yeon helped him. She learned to distinguish the traits by sight faster than he did. She had an instinct that made up for her lack of years of training. Ha Min showed her how to pollinate by hand. You take a panicle with large grains. You shake the pollen onto a panicle that ripens early. You wait. You see what happens. Out of 10 attempts, 1 yields a result. Maybe none at all. But when it works, a plant is born that carries both traits, large and early maturing, or early maturing and disease resistant. This is hybridization, the basics, without labs or microscopes, just hands and patience. Na-yeon mastered the technique in 3 days and began doing it better than he did. Her hands were more delicate, more precise. She could sense when the pollen was ready. Ha Min Woo had to check visually. She just knew. The problem with the priest didn't resolve itself. Wang Daeshik returned 10 days later. this time with a document, an order from the abbot of the Temple of Heavenly Ashes, an official investigation into heresy. Ha Min-woo was ordered to appear at the temple for questioning. Se-ah read the document and turned pale. She said that an investigation into heresy was a serious matter. It wasn't like an accusation of witchcraft from the village head. The temple had legal authority. It could confiscate property. It could place someone in custody. It could even execute someone if the tribunal decided that the accused threatened the divine order. Ha Min asked what to do. Se-ah replied that there were two options. The first was to appear for questioning and defend himself. The second was to find a patron influential enough to make the temple back down. Ha Min asked who could be such a patron. Se-ah said that in this district there was only one power higher than the temple, the House of So. Ha Min gave a grim smile. The man who wanted to take his land was the only one who could protect him from the temple. How ironic. Se-ah said there was a third way, the most dangerous and the most reliable. To become so indispensable to so many people that the temple wouldn't dare touch him. Because a popular uprising is more terrifying than heresy. Ha Min thought about it all day, then he made his decision. He didn't go to the temple. Instead, he doubled production. Every day he distributed part of the harvest to the peasants from the surrounding villages. Not for free, in exchange for work, for help, for coming and learning, but generously. So generously that people couldn't believe it. Peas by the sack, radishes by the basket, millet by the bucket. Peasants from 4 villages ate his food. Their children ate his food. Their elders ate his food. After 2 weeks, trails leading from 5 different directions wound their way to his plot. Well-trodden, visible, alive. When the temple sent 2 guards to take Ha Min away for questioning, 40 peasants were standing at the plot's gate, with pitchforks, with sticks. The guards looked, turned around, left. Se-ah was right. The one protected by a crowd is safer than behind a wall. But a crowd needs to be fed. And feeding 40 people isn't the same as feeding 4. Ha Min needed more land, more crop cycles, more harvests. He gathered everything together and the rope crept forward. 16 chon, 4 hectares. This was serious business now. The territory of a prosperous peasant farm, land on which a village could be built. And Ha Min began to build, not alone. Baek Soo-jin came to him, not just for 3 days as usual, but for good. She brought all her tools with her. An anvil, a hammer, pliers, a set of chisels, 2 sacks of raw materials, and anger in her eyes. Ha Min asked what had happened. Soo-jin said her father had kicked her out. He said she was bringing shame on the family by getting involved with an outcast. That the Baek workshop wasn't for those who forge hoes. That she wasn't a real master because real masters forge swords and armor, not garden shears. Soo-jin quoted his last words. He said she wasn't a real master because she was a woman. She stood before Ha Min and didn't cry. She never cried in front of him at all, but her hands were trembling. Ha Min silently showed her a spot at the eastern edge of the plot. A level patch of ground, a stream nearby for tempering, stones for a hearth. He said this would be her workshop. Soo-jin looked at it. She nodded. She began unloading her tools. By evening she had built a forge out of stones and clay. Small, a bit crooked, but functional. She stoked the fire and first thing, reforged the old sickle into a new one. Better than the old one. Lighter, sharper. With serrations on the inside that gripped the stalk and kept it from slipping. Ha Min tested the sickle on a row of millet. He cut 10 stalks in a single stroke. Without effort. No jerking. Clean. He looked at Soo-jin and said she was the best craftsman he'd ever met. Soo-jin turned away toward the forge and spent a very long time adjusting the coals, which didn't need adjusting. Ha Min did one more thing. He took the plow she'd forged a month ago, that very same lightweight plow designed for a single person, and asked her to engrave the name. Baek Soo-jin, Master. She asked why. Ha Min replied that when there were 100 such plows in every village, people needed to know who had made them. Soo-jin looked at him for a very long time. Then, without a word, she picked up the chisel and engraved her name. 4 characters. Even. Deep. Forever. With Soo-jin on the worksite, things moved faster. She forged everything Ha Min asked for and half of what he didn't ask for. Shovels, rakes, grafting knives, drip irrigation frames, hinges for the doors of the new huts, brackets for the frames, nails. She worked from dawn till dusk and cursed so loudly that it could be heard at the other end of the plot. Na-yeon winced at her voice but said nothing. Se-ah recorded the metal and coal consumption in a separate notebook. By the end of the 6th month, 3 huts stood on the plot. One for Ha Min and Na-yeon, one for Se-ah, one for Soo-jin, next to the workshop. The peasants working on the plot spent the night in the villages, but some were already asking to stay. It was closer for them, more convenient, and they were fed here. Ha Min harvested another crop, 32 chon, 8 hectares. The rope stretched on and on. The gray plain gave way to green, and somewhere in Sohyeon Castle, Baron So looked at a map of his estates and watched as the green patch grew. 32 chon, 8 hectares, and the first serious blow. It did not come from the baron or the priest. It came from the water. The rain began at night. It was typical rain for this time of year. Na-yeon said that the autumn rains here last for 2 weeks straight and then stop until spring. Ha Min wasn't worried. Rain means moisture. Moisture is good. But on the third day, the rain intensified. On the fourth day, the stream from which they drew water burst its banks. On the fifth day, the water flooded the eastern sector. 3 chon of peas and 2 chon of millet were submerged. Ha Min stood knee-deep in the murky water and watched the sprouts perish. Peas cannot tolerate flooding. Their roots suffocate without air. Millet holds out a little longer, but also dies. In a single night, he lost 5 chon of his crop. The rice field survived because rice loves water. But the canals had been washed away, and the water flowed unchecked. The water level rose above the embankments. The second-generation seedlings, which he had nurtured and selected one by one, bobbed in the current like straws. Ha Min rushed to save the rice. Yeon rushed after him. Sujin hauled stones to reinforce the embankments. Seo stood on dry ground and tallied the losses. They worked for 2 days straight without sleep. They reinforced the embankments. They dug drainage ditches. They pulled out the flooded plants and replanted them in raised beds. The rain didn't stop. On the 6th day, the water receded. Ha Min walked through the plot and took stock. 5 chon of the crop had been destroyed. The compost bin had been washed away. The supply of compost he'd been saving for 2 months had been swept away by the flood. 3 radish beds were flooded and had rotted. The canal from the stream was destroyed. Sujin's irrigation system was bent and clogged with mud. The rice seedlings had survived, but out of 200 sprouts, only 120 had made it. 80 were lost. Ha Min sat down on the wet ground and closed his eyes. Losing 5 chon of the harvest meant losing the doubling. The rope won't move because the harvest isn't complete. There's no half. Worse still, if he doesn't harvest a full crop from the entire plot, the next doubling won't happen. And nothing will grow on the flooded chon until the soil dries out and recovers. That's 3 weeks at a minimum. 3 weeks of emptiness. 3 weeks during which the baron might come, and the land won't be producing. Seo sat down beside him and quietly listed the figures. 2 weeks' worth of food supplies for 4 people. 1 week's worth if the peasants are fed. There's just enough seed for replanting, but barely. There's no metal to repair the tools. They need to be bought, but there's no money. Ha Min listened and thought. Then he stood up. He went to the flooded plot. He stood on a wheel and began shoveling the silt away with his hands. Silt isn't a disaster. Silt is alluvial soil, rich in minerals. If used correctly, it can become fertilizer. In the Nile Valley, farmers have lived off the floods for millennia. The floods brought silt that fertilized the fields. Egypt was sustained by the floods. Ha Min gathered the silt into piles. He mixed it with the remains of the compost. He added ash. The result was a mixture no worse than the compost that had been washed away. Different in composition, but effective. He spread it over the damaged garden beds. Na-yeon brought wild pea and vetch seeds from the forest. They replanted the flooded section. Sujin repaired the irrigation system. She straightened the frames and cleared out the pipes. She grumbled for 3 hours straight, but got it fixed. Ha Min decided not to restore the canal to its original form. Instead of a single straight channel from the stream, he dug 3, of varying depths, with stone check valves. If there's another flood, he'll be able to divert the flow away from the garden beds. A primitive irrigation system, without concrete or steel, made of earth, stones, and sticks. But it worked. 3 weeks later, the flooded plots came back to life. The peas sprouted. The vetch bloomed. The silt had done its job. The soil in these areas was even better than before the flood, darker, richer, more fertile. Ha Min smiled. The flood that had nearly destroyed him had ultimately fertilized the land. Nature is neither evil nor good. It simply is. And an agronomist must know how to work with what is available. He planted the third-generation rice on an expanded plot with a new drainage system. 400 seedlings. The grains were noticeably larger than those of the second generation. The panicles were heavier. The stems were thicker. Ha Min began to notice something else. On some seedlings, the panicles had a faint pinkish tint. Not white like ordinary wild rice. Pink, barely noticeable, like the glow of sunset on snow. He pointed it out to Na Yeon. She touched a panicle and froze. She said she had never seen pink rice before. Ha Min hadn't seen it either. In his past life, there had been red and black varieties of rice. But pink was something new, a mutation, random, unpredictable, perhaps useless, or perhaps revolutionary. He marked the pink sprouts with separate sticks, yellow ones. He would collect the seeds from them separately. He'd see what happened in the fourth generation. If the pink color was inherited, it wouldn't just be rice. It would be a variety, unique, with a name. While the rice was ripening and the soil was recovering, Ha Min faced a new problem: people. There were already 30 farmers on the plot. They worked, they ate. Sometimes they slept right in the field because they didn't have the strength to walk the 2-hour journey back to the village. They started quarreling over rations, over jobs, over who got to stand closer to Ha Ming. 2 of them got into a fight over a shovel. One stole seeds from the seed stockpile. Ha Ming didn't know what to do about it. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a boss. He didn't know how to give orders. He didn't know how to resolve conflicts. In his previous life, he had led a team of 4 lab assistants, and one of them quit because Ha Min had forgotten to wish him a happy birthday. Seah took matters into her own hands. She gathered all the farmers and announced the rules. The workday runs from dawn until noon. Meals are served after work. Portion sizes depend on the number of hours worked. Theft is punishable by a 3-day suspension. Fights are punishable by a 1-week suspension. She settles disputes. Not Ha Min. He farms. She manages. Ha Min stood nearby and nodded. He was more grateful to her than he could put into words. And to express this in the only way he knew how, that very evening he drew up the farm's first document on a piece of tanned leather that Seah had bought at the market. The Yoon farm. Shares. Yoon Ha Min, 30%. Che Na Yeon, 30%. Baek Soo Jin, 25%. Oh Seah, 15%. He showed the document to Seah. She read it for a long time. Then she read it again. Then she looked at him. She asked why she had the smallest share. Ha Min replied that she had arrived last. Seah nodded. That made sense. Then she asked why they had even included her at all. After all, she had arrived a week ago. Ha Min replied that without her, they wouldn't have received the deed. Without the deed, the Baron would have taken the land. Without the land, there would be nothing to divide. Seah stood up. Silently, she took the document. Silently, she went back to her hut. She didn't come out until morning. In the morning, she brought a plan. 12 pages of fine handwriting. A 5-cycle farm development plan. Resource allocation. Trade routes. A list of necessary purchases. Yield forecasts. Risk analysis. 5 courses of action in the event of an attack by the Baron. Ha Min read it and smiled. A 15% stake had turned into a 100% return. Seah began working as if the farm were her own, because, for the first time in her life, it truly was hers. By the end of the 7th month, Ha Min had harvested a full crop from all 32 chon, including those restored after the flood. Peas, millet, radishes, 3rd-generation rice. The rope crept forward. 64 cha, 16 hectares. That was more than any peasant in the district had. More than the village headman. More than half of the minor nobles. Ha Min stood on the hill and looked out over the green expanse that, just half a year ago, had been a gray, lifeless plain. 16 hectares of living land. 30 workers. 4 women who had become his family, though he had never uttered that word. Rice with pink panicles. Compost that smelled of life. And the silence that once again deceived no one. 64 chon and the first snow. Winter had come early. Na Yeon said that the first snow usually falls 3 weeks later. This year it fell a month early. Light. Wet, melting by noon. But in the mornings, the ground turned white and the sprouts were covered with frost. Ha Min had been preparing for winter ever since the day he saw the first yellow leaves on the trees. He knew that winter here isn't just cold, it's a test. If he survives the winter with his supplies and seeds, he'll start the spring at double the pace. If not, it'll all be over. The compost would freeze. The worms would burrow deep into the soil. The bacteria would go dormant. The earth would come to a standstill. The first thing he did was gather everything he could before the frosts set in. The last harvest of peas, the last radish, the fourth-generation rice that he'd rushed to maturity by covering the field with straw at night. He gathered it, he dried it, packed it. Saya calculated the supplies. Enough grain for 3 months for 4 people. It won't be enough for 30 workers. The farmers will return to their villages for the winter. They'll eat what they've stockpiled themselves, plus what Ha Min distributed to them this fall. It should be enough, unless grain prices skyrocket even higher. The second thing he did was build a granary, a small one, made of logs and clay, with thick walls and a door hinged by Sujin. Inside it's dry and dark, ideal conditions for storing grain. CA sorted the supplies into sacks and labeled each one. Seed rice, table rice, seed millet, table millet, peas, radish seeds, and clover seeds, vetch seeds. Next to them stood a small, separate sack containing fourth-generation pink grains. 32 grains, each one worth its weight in gold. Third is firewood. The forest is nearby. There's plenty of firewood, but chopping without an axe is torture. Sujin forged an axe in 2 days. It was heavy, rough, but it chopped well. Ha Min and Na Yun stockpiled a month's worth of firewood. They stacked it under a shed. On the 5th day of snowfall, Kim Da-eun arrived. Ha Min didn't know who she was. He'd only seen a group of people on the road, about 50 of them. Men in tattered uniforms, women, and children. A cart with meager belongings. Leading the way was a young woman riding a scrawny horse. Her back was straight, her hair was short, a sword hung from her belt, her face was as hard as stone. She stopped at the gate to the compound and asked if it was true that they were feeding people here. Ha Min came out and looked at the 50 people behind her. Soldiers, former soldiers, emaciated, hungry, some were wounded, children hid behind their mothers' backs. Ha Min asked who she was. She introduced herself. Kim Da-eun, the daughter of General Kim Tae-uk, who had been executed for refusing to suppress a peasant uprising in the southern province. These people were her father's former soldiers. After the general's execution, their unit was disbanded. Their pay was taken away. They were declared vagrants. They had been walking for 2 months, without food, without shelter, and without a destination, until they heard about an outcast who fed anyone who came to him. Ha Min looked at Saya. Saya glanced at her notebook, then at the people, then at Ha Min. She said quietly that if he took in 50 people, their supplies would last 6 weeks instead of 3 months. Ha Min looked at the children. A girl of about 5 was holding the hand of a boy of about 3. The boy's lips were blue. Ha Min opened the gate. Da-eun led her people onto the grounds. They stood and looked at the field covered with a thin layer of snow. They looked the way people look who have long since given up hope. Ha Min ordered Na Yun to build a fire. He ordered Saya to open the granary. He ordered Sujin to fetch the large cauldron she had forged a week ago for making compost. They cooked porridge. From rice, from peas, from the last radish, from dried onions. The pot was huge and yet still too small for 50 people. Ha Min handed out bowls, to everyone. The child with blue lips received the first one. Ha Min poured the porridge for him himself and sat down next to him on the ground. He tasted a spoonful from the boy's bowl. Then he gave the spoon back to the boy. The boy ate and cried. Not out of grief, because the food was hot. He'd forgotten that food could be hot. Da-eun stood and watched. Then she approached Ha Min. She knelt on one knee. She placed her sword before him. She said that her people and her blade belonged to him. Ha Min lifted her by the shoulder and told her to stand up. He didn't need her blade. He needed her hands, for planting, for building, for driving posts into the ground for new huts, because 50 people wouldn't fit in just 3 huts. Da-eun looked at him as if he'd said something incomprehensible. She was a warrior, a general's daughter. She knew how to command, kill, and defend. She didn't know how to plant crops. Ha Min said she would learn. She did learn. Kim's soldiers turned the plot around in 2 weeks. They knew how to work. Military discipline isn't just about formation and marching. It's the ability to do hard, monotonous work without complaining. They dug ditches. They chopped down trees. They hauled stones. They erected walls. In 14 days, 6 new huts sprang up on the site. Barrack style. Long, low, each housing 10 people. Sujin forged hinges and brackets non-stop. Her forge burned round the clock. She had grown gaunt and blackened with soot, but her eyes burned with determination. This was work. Real work. Not horseshoes or kitchen knives, but the construction of an entire settlement. Ha Min divided the soldiers into sectors. 10 men to clear the new plot, 10 for construction, 10 to gather firewood and water, and 10 to help in the fields. 10 for rest and rotation. Da-eun commanded them as she always did, firmly, without unnecessary words. They obeyed her as they would their father, because to them, she was their father. Saya recalculated everything. With 50 people, food consumption had tripled.
but the workforce had also tripled.
If they cleared and prepared new fields over the winter, they could plant twice as much in the spring. The spring harvest would cover the shortfall, if they survived until spring. Ha Min solved the food problem in an unconventional way. He went into the forest and began searching for things the locals didn't consider food: acorns, chestnuts, fern rhizomes, dried mushrooms, moss that, after soaking and boiling, turned into something resembling jelly, the bark of certain trees that, when ground, yielded coarse flour. Not tasty, not nutritious, but it had calories. Na Yeon knew about each of these plants. She showed him 5 more food sources he hadn't even suspected existed. Wild lotus root in a frozen pond. Tubers that the locals considered poisonous, but which became safe after being boiled 3 times. Seeds from a certain tree that tasted nutty when roasted. Together they made up their winter ration. Meager, monotonous, but sufficient. No one would starve to death. Winter was bearing down. The snow grew deeper. The temperature dropped. The ground froze 2 fingers deep. But beneath the straw mulch that Ha Min had spread over the garden beds in the fall, the soil remained soft. The worms had burrowed deeper but hadn't died. The bacteria had slowed down but hadn't died. Everything would wake up in the spring, if spring came. Ha Min sat in his hut that evening and by the light of a tallow lamp examined 32 pink grains. He placed each one separately on a piece of cloth. He touched them. He weighed them in his palm. The largest one weighed twice as much as ordinary wild rice. The color was even, not mottled, pink from base to tip. If the 5th generation confirms that the color is inherited and the grain retains its size, this rice will become something the world has never seen. Pink rice, the Yoon variety. No, not the Yoon variety, just pink. Names can come later. First, grow it. Na Yeon walked into the hut and sat down beside him. She looked at the grains. She reached out and touched one. She said it was warm. Ha Min replied that all grains feel warm if you hold them in your hands for a long time. Na Yeon shook her head. Not from the hands, from the inside. Ha Min didn't argue. Maybe she sensed something he couldn't measure. Maybe not. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that come spring, these 32 grains would become 22 sprouts. And from those 32 sprouts, he would develop a variety that would feed thousands. Winter lasted 3 months. Every day was the same. Up before dawn, feeding, work, feeding, work. Sleep. There wasn't enough food. By midwinter, their rations had been cut to 2 meals a day. In the morning, porridge made from acorn flour with dried mushrooms. In the evening, a root vegetable soup with a handful of millet. There was no meat. There was no milk. There was no butter. There was almost no salt. People were losing weight. They were growing weaker. They were coughing. 3 soldiers fell ill. Na Yeon treated them with herbal decoctions. Gentian for fever, willow bark for pain, moss for coughs. 2 of them recovered. The 3rd was in bad shape. An old soldier in his 50s with a jagged scar across his cheek. He lay in the barracks, wheezing. Na Yeon said he needed honey. Honey was an antiseptic and a source of sugar, which the body needed to fight infection. There was no honey. Ha Min went into the forest. He searched for 2 days. He found a wild beehive in a hollow of a tall tree, a half-hour's walk from the camp. He climbed up. The bees stung his hands, neck, and face. He pulled out a piece of honeycomb the size of 2 palms. He climbed down. His hands were swollen. One eye was bloodshot. He brought the honeycomb to Na Yeon. She squeezed out the honey and gave it to the sick man to drink. 3 days later, the old soldier was back on his feet. He walked over to Ha Min, who was standing in the field covering the garden beds with straw. He stood beside him. He said nothing. He simply began covering the garden beds. From then on, he worked every day until spring, silently, without breaks, as if he were paying off a debt that couldn't be repaid with words. Da-eun saw this, and something inside her shifted. She went to Ha Min that evening and asked why he had climbed the tree. He could have died from bee stings. Ha Min replied that the old man could have died from a fever. Da-eun said that the old man was a former soldier and knew what he was getting into, that his life wasn't worth Ha Min's, because without Ha Min, everyone else would die too. Ha Min looked at her and said he didn't see it that way, that the old man wasn't a soldier or a mere unit of labor, that the old man had a name, Park Chun-ho, and that he had a son among these soldiers, and a 3-year-old granddaughter who was sleeping right now in the barracks. That if Park Chun-ho died, his granddaughter would grow up without a grandfather, and that was unacceptable. Da-eun was silent for a very long time. Then she said that her father used to say similar things. He was executed for it. Ha Min replied that her father was right. Daun stood up and left. She stopped at the door. She said that if Ha Min climbed that tree with the bees one more time, she'd tie him to a post. Ha Min smiled. It was the first joke he'd heard from her. By the end of winter, 3 important things had happened on the farm. First, Daun began teaching the children. There were 11 of them. Soldiers' children, aged 3 to 12. They ran around the compound and got in the way of work. Daun gathered them in one hut and began teaching them the alphabet, then counting, then map drawing. She did this with military precision. Wake up, class, recess, class, lunch, class, lights out. The children obeyed her unquestioningly because she was more fearsome than any teacher. But when she praised them, and she did so rarely and sparingly, the children beamed. Ha Min noticed this and suggested she add the basics of agronomy to the curriculum. Daun asked why. Ha Min replied that a warrior who knows how to fight will feed his family through war. A warrior who knows how to plant will feed his family with food, and the second is better. Daun didn't reply. But the next day, the children sat by the garden bed and listened as Ha Min explained why worms are necessary for the soil. Second thing, a new resident arrived. Quiet, unobtrusive, a girl of about 19 who introduced herself as Ju, just Ju, no last name. She said she was looking for work in the kitchen. She knew how to cook and wash dishes. Seo took her on and put her to work in the kitchen. Ju worked quickly and neatly. She didn't complain. She didn't chatter. She ate very little. She slept on the floor by the hearth. The only thing strange about her was the way she spoke. She spoke too properly for a kitchen maid. She chose her words carefully. She pronounced them clearly, without a rural accent, like someone who had attended a good school. Ha Min noticed. Seo noticed too, but both kept quiet. They were short-handed, and no one asked unnecessary questions. In the second week, Ju did something that caught Ha Min's attention. He was sitting by the fire, grumbling to himself that the acidity in the eastern sector was too high and that he needed limestone but had no idea where to find it in this world. He was grumbling in Russian, or rather in Korean, that Korean from her past life, with Seoul slang and scientific terms. Ju, who was washing the cauldron 5 steps away, suddenly chuckled quietly. Ha Min froze. He asked what was so funny. Ju quickly said it was nothing. She just remembered a funny story. Ha Min didn't press her for details, but he took note. She had laughed after a phrase in Korean that no one in this world could understand, unless they'd read books from across the sea. Banned books. Books that people in the Hwachon Empire spoke of only in whispers. Books that were supposedly written by people who had come from another world. Ha Min put that thought aside for later. Right now, there were more important matters. The third thing, spring. It arrived in a single day, literally. There had been snow on the ground that evening. By morning, it was gone. The sun beat down so fiercely that by noon, the earth was steaming. Ha Min went out to his plot and knelt down. He plunged his hand into the soil. Warm, soft, moist, the worms stirred. He could feel them moving beneath his fingers. Life was awakening. Ha Min took out a small bag containing 32 pink grains. It was time. He had prepared a separate plot for the pink rice. A small one, 3 by 3 meters, with perfect soil, compost mixed with biochar, silt from the fall flood, and ash, the very best he had. He planted each grain separately, a palm's width apart. 32 grains, 32 hopes. He watered them, covered them with mulch, and waited. On the third day, the first sprouts emerged. By the 5th day, all 32 were standing, green, slender, with a barely noticeable pink hue at the base of the stem. Yun stood nearby and smiled. Ha Min smiled too. Then he turned away because he had to sow the remaining 64 chon, and there was no time for smiles. Spring is a race. Every day counts. He divided up the work. Daun's soldiers plowed new plots with negatives. The farmers from Chochon sowed peas and millet. Na-yun supervised the planting of green manure crops. Se-ah counted the seeds and measured out the portions. Su-jin forged non-stop, new plows, new sickles, and new irrigation frames. Daun oversaw the construction of 4 more huts. Ju cooked in the kitchen and silently watched everything with an expression Ha Min couldn't read. In the 3rd week of spring, the first merchant arrived at the plot. He wasn't just passing through, he'd come specifically for this. He'd heard about the fertile land and wanted to buy radishes. Se-ah met him. She named her price. The merchant laughed. The price was half the market rate. He didn't understand. Se-ah explained. A low price, but a large volume. And regular deliveries, every 2 weeks. consistent, reliable, not like the farmers who sell whenever they can and however much they can, but on a schedule, according to plan. The merchant stopped laughing. He looked at the vegetable beds, at the granary, at Saya with her notebook. He agreed. The first sale, the first money, copper coins that jingled in a canvas bag. Ha Min held the bag and thought that 4 months ago he had traded his last button for a bucket of rotten vegetables. And now he was selling radishes for money. Saya took the pouch and said the money would go towards salt and cloth. Ha Min didn't argue. Money was her domain. His domain was the land, and the land was growing. A week later, he harvested his first spring crop, 128 chon, 32 hectares. The rope crept forward. The green spot on the map of the plain became a green spot on the map of the county. And at Sohyeon Castle, Baron So finally stopped smiling. 128 chon, 32 hectares. A village that wasn't on the map, but that fed 5 neighboring villages. Ha Min named it Chonnon, Greenfield. Saya put the name in writing and registered it with the county office for 3 measures of rice and 1 measure of peas. Now it was an official settlement, with a name, with a population of 92 people, with a granary, a smithy, and 11 huts, and with problems that were growing faster than the vegetable beds. Baron So sent a messenger, not with a threat, but with an invitation. Ha Min was invited to Sohyeon Castle for dinner. Saya read the invitation twice and said it was either a trap or a negotiation, perhaps both at the same time. Ha Min asked if he should go. Saya replied that not going would be worse. Declining the Baron's invitation was an insult. An insulted Baron is more dangerous than one who is merely interested. Ha Min went, not alone. Saya went with him as his manager. Daun went along as a bodyguard. Ha Min said they didn't need a bodyguard. Daun replied that it wasn't up for discussion. Sohyeon Castle turned out not to be a castle at all, but a large estate. Stone walls, a tiled roof, a courtyard with stables, a garden with a pond. Beautiful and neglected at the same time. The plaster was cracking. The pond was overgrown with duckweed. The garden hadn't been tended in a long time. The Baron met them in the main hall. So Gi-ho, the younger brother of the head of the Seo house. A 50-year-old man with a gentle face and stern eyes, well-dressed, well-groomed hands, not a single callus. Sitting next to him was a man Ha Min hadn't expected to see, Seo Byung-taek, the head of the So house, the owner of the grain monopoly, one of the 3 most influential people in the empire. 52 years old, elegant, thin, with graying temples and a smile that sent a chill down Ha Min's spine. He had come in person, all the way from the capital to this remote backwater, for the sake of an exile with a brand on his arm. It was either flattering or a very bad sign. Seo Byung-taek poured him some tea, real tea, fragrant tea. Ha Min hadn't drunk tea like this since he woke up. They were silent for a minute. Then Seo Byung-taek spoke, calmly, like a man accustomed to being listened to. He said he knew everything about Ha Min, about the dead land, about the doubling, about the community, about the pink rice, about the peasants who protect him. He said he was impressed, and that he had a proposal. Ha Min could join the So house, as a junior partner. His land would remain his community would remain his rice would become the So house's brand. In return, he would receive protection from the temple, protection from the other houses, a title, money, anything he desires. The only condition, to stop giving away grain for free. Ha Min asked why. Seo Byung-taek smiled and said something Ha Min would remember for the rest of his life. He said that a hungry peasant works, a well-fed peasant thinks, and a thinking peasant asks questions. For example, why do 3 families own all the grain in the empire? Or why can't the emperor feed his people? Or why does the land belong to those who have never held a hoe in their hands? Seo Byung-taek said that Ha Min, with his free grain, was destroying the order that had sustained the empire for 1,000 years. That this order was imperfect but stable, and that stability was more valuable than justice. Ha Min remained silent while Seo Byung-taek spoke. Then he finished his tea. He set down his cup. He looked at the head of the So house and replied. He said that was exactly what he wanted, for the peasants to think. Seo Byung-taek stopped smiling, not because he was angry, but because he realized the conversation was over. He nodded. He stood up. He said it was a pity that Ha Min could have become a rich man, that now he would be a dead man, not right now, but soon. He left. Baron So Gi-ho remained seated, looking at Ha Min with the expression of someone watching someone else jump into an abyss. On the way back, Saya was silent. Daun was silent. Ha Min was silent too. Everyone knew what had happened. The war had begun. Not a formal one, not a declared one, but a real one. The So family controlled the grain supply in 3 provinces. They could crash prices and ruin Ha Min.
They could raise prices and starve his community into submission. They could send mercenaries. They could bribe the county official and revoke the charter. They could do all of this at once. Ha Min returned to Cheongnon and summoned everyone: Nayeon, Sujin, Seo, Daeun, and Ju. He told them what had happened and asked what they should do. Nayeon said they needed to grow more crops. Seo said they needed to expand their trade. Sujin said they needed to forge weapons. Daeun said they needed to reinforce the walls. Ju said nothing. She just sat there listening with that inscrutable expression of hers. Ha Min said they were all right, but there was another way. He stood up and walked out to the field. He returned with a basket of pink rice. The 5th generation, the first real harvest. The grains were large, uniform, and bright pink. He cooked a handful right in front of everyone. The rice turned out tender, fragrant, with a slightly sweet aftertaste that ordinary rice doesn't have. Everyone tasted it. Nayeon closed her eyes and remained silent for a long time. Then she said it was the most beautiful rice she'd ever seen in her life. Ha Min said that this rice was their weapon. Not a sword, not a wall. Rice. Seo was the first to understand. If the pink rice entered the market as a unique product found nowhere else in the empire, its price would be determined not by the So clan's grain monopoly, but by demand. Demand for something no one else has cannot be controlled. Ha Min nodded. He planted pink rice on 20 chon out of 128. The best plots, the best soil, biochar, compost, silt, and mycorrhizae. Everything he had. He planted the remaining chon with regular food crops. In 2 months, he'll harvest enough pink rice to sell, and the House of So won't be able to do anything about it, because you can't monopolize something that doesn't exist in your own fields. While the rice was growing, So Gyeongtaek struck the first blow. Not by himself, through a priest. Wang Dae-sik received an order from the supreme abbot in the capital.
An official charge of heresy, confiscation of property, arrest, execution. 24 temple guards set out from the county seat toward Cheongnon. Daeun found out a day earlier. Her people were monitoring the roads. She went to Ha Min and told him the guards would arrive tomorrow morning. 20 men, armed, with orders. Ha Min asked how many fighters they had. Daeun said 47, but they were poorly armed. 12 swords. The rest had clubs and pitchforks. Up against 20 trained temple guards with spears. They could win, but there would be casualties. Ha Min said there would be no casualties, because there wouldn't be a fight. He left the hut and set out through the villages. Thochon, Hasan, Chungmok, Taebon, Sori. 5 villages, a 5-hour walk. 5 conversations with village elders who had eaten his peas and radishes all winter and whose children, for the first time in a year, hadn't gone hungry. In the morning, when the temple guards rode up to Cheongnon, standing on the road were not 47 soldiers, but 300 peasants, with pitchforks, rakes, and hoes. In silence, shoulder to shoulder. The guards stopped. Their commander looked at the crowd, at their faces, at the tools in their hands, at the silence. He turned his horse around and rode away. 20 guards against 300 men with nothing to lose. That's not a battle. It's suicide. Ha Min stood in the back rows and watched. He didn't say a word. He didn't pick up a pitchfork or a stick. He stood in his work jacket, dirt under his fingernails, and watched as the 300 people he had fed defended his right to continue feeding them. That evening, Seo said this wasn't the end, but a pause. So Gyeongtaek wouldn't stop. He'd simply change his tactics. Ha Min nodded. He looked out at the field. The pink rice stood in neat rows. In a month, it would bloom. Pink panicles at sunset. He could already picture it in his mind. All that was left was to wait. The pink rice bloomed at sunset. Nayeon stood by the fence, motionless. The panicles were pink from base to tip, not pale like those of the 4th generation, but bright and rich, like cherry blossoms in spring. 20 chon of pink ears of rice against the backdrop of the setting sun. It was so beautiful that even Sujin came out of the smithy and watched in silence. Nayeon reached out and touched the nearest ear of rice. Then, with her other hand, she took Ha Min by the wrist. Not by the hand, by the wrist. Right where the brand was, and she held it until the sun set. Ha Min didn't pull his hand away. The harvest was gathered 3 weeks later. 200 mur of pink rice. By imperial standards, it was a negligible amount. By Ha Min's standards, it was a victory. 200 mur of a unique product found nowhere else in the world. Seo developed a sales plan, not at the market in Tochon, not in the county seat, in the capital. The rice had to be shown to those who could appreciate it. Aristocrats, officials, chefs of the imperial kitchen, people who knew good taste and understood rarity. The problem was how to deliver the rice to the capital through territory controlled by the House of So. Seiya solved this problem elegantly. She didn't transport the rice along the main road. She sent it with 5 different merchants from 5 different villages, in small batches, 40 measures each, via different routes, disguised as ordinary grain. Even if the House of So intercepted one batch, the other 4 would make it through. 3 shipments made it. 1 was intercepted by the Baron's men on the road. 1 was delayed for a week due to a washed-out bridge, but 3 made it. 120 measures of pink rice reached the capital. The merchants sold it at the market near the White Crane Temple, the most expensive market in the empire, where servants of the great houses and palaces. The pink rice had the effect that Ha Ming had dreamed of but hadn't fully believed in. The cooks tasted it and fell silent. Then they tasted some more. Then they started asking where it came from. Then they started haggling. The price skyrocketed to a level that Seiya hadn't even included in her most optimistic forecast. 30 coins per measure. Regular rice cost 3. The pink rice cost 10 times as much, not because it was 10 times better, but because it was the only one of its kind. The money returned to Chonon a month later. 3,600 coins. Ha Min held the bag of money and didn't know what to do with it. Seiya knew. She bought livestock, 10 goats, 4 oxen, 2 horses. She bought cloth, salt, and iron for the blacksmith shop. She bought seeds at the capital's market, wheat, barley, and beans that weren't available in the area. She bought tools that Sujin couldn't forge, saws, planes, and drills. She bought paper, ink, and brushes for keeping records. Ha Min finally got a real notebook instead of bark. He sat down that evening and transferred all his notes, all his observations from the past year, all the data on rice generations, all his notes on the soil, the weather, and crop yields. The notebook filled up in 2 days. He needed a second one. Alongside his trading, Ha Min harvested the entire crop from all 120 chong. The rope stretched. 256 chong, 64 hectares. This was the Baron's territory. Formally, Ha Min now owned land equal in area to the estates of Baron So Gi-ho. An outcast with a brand on his hand owned as much land as a nobleman with a lineage stretching back 10 generations. It was impossible, but the rope knew no such word as impossible. It knew only the law. The land recognizes the one who fed it. The Baron found out. So Gyeongtaek found out. The temple found out. Everyone found out. And what Seiya feared most of all began. Not an attack, not an order, a trial. The So family filed a petition with the imperial court to review the status of Yoon Ha Min's land. The grounds. Cursed land cannot be private property. It belongs to the empire. The exile was granted 1 square meter as a punishment, not as a gift. The expansion of the plot is not provided for by law. Consequently, all land exceeding 1 square meter belongs to the empire. Consequently, as the tenant of imperial lands in this district, Dam So's claim was legally flawless. Ha Min is not a lawyer. Seiya is not a lawyer. But Ju read the petition and quietly said that there was an error in it. Everyone turned to her. Ju said that the imperial code contains an article on the right of first harvest. If a person has grown a crop on land that had not borne fruit for over 100 years, the land is recognized as his personal property by right of reclamation. This article had not been applied for 300 years because no one had reclaimed barren land, but it had not been repealed. Seiya asked how Ju knew the imperial code. Ju fell silent. Then she said quietly that she had read it. She had read a lot. Seiya looked at her long and intently. Then she took out the petition and asked Ju if she could write a reply. Ju took up a brush and in 3 hours wrote a legal response to the So House's petition, 4 pages long, in flawless calligraphic handwriting, with references to 14 articles of the imperial code. Seiya read it and turned pale, not because of the content, because of the realization. Kitchen maids don't know the imperial code. Kitchen maids don't write in calligraphy. Kitchen maids don't quote 300-year-old laws from memory. That evening, Seiya went to Ha Min and told him that Ju wasn't who she claimed to be. Ha Min replied that he knew, ever since the day she laughed at his Korean phrase. Seiya asked what he was going to do. Ha Min said nothing. If Ju wants to be Ju, then she's Ju. When she's ready to tell the story, she'll tell it. Seiya shook her head and said that Ha Min was impossible. Ha Min shrugged and went to check on the rice. The response to the petition had been sent to the capital. The court had accepted it for consideration. This meant that while the case was pending, no one could touch the land, not Dam So, not the temple,
and not the barren. Legal protection, temporary but real. Saya had bought some time. Ju had bought some time. Ha Min used that time to harvest the next crop and expand the land to 512 chon, 128 hectares, more than the baron had, more than the county magistrate had. A territory where 200 people now lived, with granaries, a blacksmith shop, and a school where Daun taught 30 children. With a medicinal herb garden that Na Yun had turned into a veritable pharmacy. With a workshop where Sujin forged plows bearing her name. With a kitchen where Ju cooked rice that cost 10 times as much as usual. And with a field of pink rice that glowed at sunset so brightly that travelers would stop on the road to gaze at it. Toward the end of the second year, a girl arrived in Cheonnon, alone, with no belongings, barefoot. She was about 17, but she looked 14. Small, skinny, with eyes that looked right through people, as if she could see something behind them. She didn't give her name. She stood at the gate and silently gazed at the field. Daun approached her and asked who she was and where she was from. The girl didn't answer. Daun asked if she had a family. The girl shook her head. Daun took her to the kitchen and gave her a bowl of porridge. The girl ate slowly, as if she'd forgotten how to do it. Then she stood up and went out into the field. She walked over to the patch of pink rice, crouched down. She placed her palm on the ground and froze. Na Yun saw her and walked over. She asked what she was doing. The girl lifted her head and spoke her first word of the day. She said that the earth here was singing, that it had been singing for a long time. That the girl had heard this song from far away, a 3-day walk, and had followed the sound. Na Yun turned pale. She called for Ha Min. Ha Min came over and saw the girl sitting by the garden bed with her hand on the ground. He crouched down beside her. He asked her name. She said she didn't remember. She had always been called simply the girl. At the orphanage where she grew up, they didn't give out names. Ha Min asked what she wanted to be called. The girl thought for a moment. Then she said, soul, because salt is necessary for the earth, and for food, and for people. Ha Min nodded. Moon soul. She didn't explain why moon, she just said it, and that was that. Soul stayed. She didn't work in the fields like the others. She didn't dig, she didn't water, she didn't weed. She walked around the plot and touched the soil. She touched the plants. She stood nearby and listened. Sometimes she'd tell Na Yun that this row needed water and that one needed sun. Na Yun would check. Soul was right every time. Not just roughly, exactly. Ha Min watched her for 3 weeks. Then he called her over to the rice patch. He showed her 2 sprouts. One was healthy, the other was slightly yellowed. He asked what was wrong with it. Soul crouched down. She touched the water. She touched the stem. She said it was sad, because there was a stone beneath it. Ha Min reached into the plot and felt with his hands a flat stone beneath the roots that was preventing them from growing deeper. He removed it. A week later, the sprout straightened up and turned green. Ha Min couldn't explain Soul's ability. It wasn't scientific. It wasn't rational. But it worked. She sensed the earth the way he sensed formulas, intuitively, unerringly, as if there were a connection between her and the soil that couldn't be measured by instruments. Na Yun said that Soul was a blessing. Ha Min said that Soul was a mystery. They were both right. In Soul's second month there, something happened that changed everything. Ha Min was digging up the old plot, that very first meter where it all began. It had expanded 1,000-fold, but that first meter was still there, right in the center. Dark, rich, the most fertile spot on the entire plot. The shovel struck something hard, a rock. Ha Min began digging with his hands. Not a rock, something flat, rectangular, a stone slab the size of a book. He pulled it out, brushed the dirt off. There were symbols on the surface, ancient, faded, but legible. Ha Min couldn't read them.
He called Saya. Saya couldn't either. He called Ju. Ju read the first line and turned pale. It was an archaic language, very old. But Ju read it fluently. She said what was written on the slab. Here lies the codex of the earth, to be kept until the one who feeds the dead arrives. Ha Min looked at Soul. Soul was standing nearby, staring at the slab. Then she crouched down. She placed her palm on the stone, and the stone cracked. Not from a blow, not from pressure. It cracked from her touch. Inside lay a bundle, leather, old, almost petrified. Inside the leather were thin wooden slates inscribed with text. The Codex of the Earth, a treatise written 1,000 years ago by the first emperor farmer. Ju unfolded the slates and read. Her hands were trembling. She read aloud, and everyone listened. The Codex told of a covenant between the first emperor and the earth. The emperor came into the world after the Great Ash. He came from another place, just like Ha Min.
He found a dead continent and began to revive it, 1 meter at a time. The earth responded to him. It expanded its boundaries. It yielded a harvest. It acknowledged him. He recorded the law. The land belongs to the one who nourishes it. The one who nourishes the dead receives the living. The one who restores the first meter shall become the heir. Ha Min listened and laughed quietly, not out of joy, but out of recognition. The first emperor was just like him, a stranger, an agronomist, a man from another world who knew how to listen to the soil. The last tablet was inscribed in a different language, not the language of the empire, in Korean, archaic Korean from the Joseon era. Ha Min read it himself. The first line read, "Today I planted the first seed. The land here is dead, but I know what to do." Ha Min read and wiped his eyes with his sleeve, because 1,000 years ago, another Korean stood in this very spot and felt the same thing: fear, hope, and the absolute certainty that soil is not just dirt, it is life. Seiya asked what it all meant. Zhu replied quietly and calmly. It means that Yoon Ha Min, by the right of the Earth Codex, is the legitimate heir to the Hwachon Empire. Silence hung in the air for a minute. Then Ha Min said he didn't need an empire, he needed compost, and that if they were done with archaeology, the rice in the eastern field needed fertilizing. Everyone looked at him. He walked over to the rice. Then he turned around. He looked at Sol. He asked if she wanted her greenhouse. Sol nodded, and for the first time, she smiled. Zhu told the truth on the third day after the codex was found. Not because she'd been exposed, it was because she decided to do so herself. She gathered everyone around the campfire that evening. She stood up, straightened her back, and became a different person. Not Ju, the kitchen maid, but Li Ju-hee, the fourth daughter of Emperor Li Gon, the youngest princess of the Hwachon Empire. She had fled the palace 8 months ago. Her father wanted to marry her off to Duke Mo, a 60-year-old widower with 3 wives and a reputation she preferred not to describe. She fled through the garden at night, carrying a single sack and without any guards. She walked for 2 months. She heard about Cheonnon. She came. She called herself Ju. She scrubbed pots and was happier than she'd been in all 19 years at the palace. Because for the first time, she was doing something with her own hands. Daun placed her hand on the hilt of her sword. Seiya turned pale. Sujin cursed. Nayeon remained silent. Sol sat and looked at Ju-hee as if she'd always known. Ha Min listened. Then he asked one thing. Did she want to stay? Ju-hee looked at him. Then at the garden bed by the hut, a small 3-square-meter plot that Ha Min had set aside for her a month ago. Strawberries were growing there, wild, small, and red. The first berries had just begun to turn red. Ju-hee had found the bushes in the forest and transplanted them herself. She watered them every day, weeded them, talked to them, and scolded them when the leaves turned yellow. She replied that she wanted to stay. Ha Min nodded and said the matter was settled. Seiya said the matter wasn't settled. She said that once the palace finds out where she is, they'll send not 20 guards, but 200. Ju-hee said the palace has other things to worry about right now. The father is old. The heir is weak. The southern provinces are in revolt. The 3 great houses are vying for influence. A 4th daughter who ran away from her wedding is a minor issue compared to a civil war. Seiya nodded. For now, but not forever. Ha Min returned to his work. By the end of the 2nd year, Cheonnon numbered 250 people, 512 chon, 128 hectares, the territory of the minor nobility, with fields and granaries, a workshop, a school, and an infirmary that Nayeon had set up in a separate hut, with trade connections in 5 cities, with a reputation that preceded its supply trains. Yoon's pink rice. That's what they called it in the markets. Not the rice of an exile. Yoon's rice. The name ceased to be a stigma and became a brand. Ha Min drafted a document he had been mulling over for half a year, the Land Charter. The first set of rules in the history of this world that stated, the land belongs to the one who cultivates it, not to the one who bought a piece of paper with a seal, not to the one who inherited it from a grandfather, not to the one who took it by force, but to the one who stands on it with a hoe and feeds others. Seiya edited the text. Ju-hee checked the legal aspects. Daun signed as a witness. Nayeon added her signature. Sujin engraved a copy of the text onto a copper plate.
Sol placed her palm on the plate and declared that the metal agreed. No one smiled. They were used to it. The charter was posted at the gates of Chonon. Everyone entering could read it. Peasants from the surrounding villages came and stood before it. They read it. They reread it. Some wept. Because for the first time in 1,000 years, someone had written what they had always known but never dared to say. The earth is alive, and it is not a commodity. So Gyeongtaek read the charter through his spies and realized that Ha Min was more dangerous than he had thought, not because he owned a lot of land, but because he was giving people an idea more dangerous than any sword. The House of So struck, not with guards, with fire, at night, without warning. 15 mercenaries set the southern fields ablaze. 20 chon of pink rice caught fire at 3 in the morning. The flames were visible from Chochon. Ha Min woke up to Da-eun's scream. He ran out of the hut. The southern horizon was ablaze. Orange fire raced like a wall across the dry stalks. 20 chon. All the pink rice for this season. Seeds for next year. Months of work. He ran toward the field, knowing he wouldn't make it in time. No one would. The rice was dry and burned like straw. Da-eun roused the soldiers. They ran with buckets. The farmers ran with buckets, but the fire was faster. By dawn, 20 chon of pink rice had turned into a black field. Ha Min stood at the edge and looked at the ashes. A year's work. 2 generations of breeding, thousands of grains. It was all burned to ashes. Seo approached and asked quietly, "The counter will reset to 0. Ha Min nodded. If the soil is damaged, the rope retracts to the last successful size. He hadn't lost 20 chon of the harvest. He'd lost the doubling. The rope had shrunk. From 512 chon to 256. Half the area. It had simply vanished. Ha Min sat down on the scorched earth and closed his eyes. A minute later, he opened them. He stood up. He looked at Na-yeon. He asked if she had saved the seeds. Na-yeon nodded. A separate little bag. 6th-generation pink rice seeds. 50 grains. She'd kept them in the infirmary, in a clay pot under the floor. The fire hadn't reached the infirmary. 50 grains. Enough to start over. Ha Min took the little bag. He looked at the scorched field. He looked at the people standing around him, their faces blackened with soot, and he said one word. Let's plant. They sowed the scorched patch that very same day. Ash is potassium. Burnt organic matter is carbon. The field after the fire is not dead. It's fertilized. Brutally. Roughly. But fertilized. A week later, the first sprouts appeared. Green against black. Like hope rising from the ashes. So Gyeongtaek expected Ha Min to break down. He expected the community to fall apart. He expected the people to scatter. He didn't count on one thing. People who were fed when they were starving don't scatter when the field is on fire. They grab buckets, they put out the fire, and they plant again. A month later, pink rice was growing once more in the southern field. The 7th generation, larger, more fragrant, pinker, as if the fire had tempered it. The 3rd year began with rain. Warm spring rain that fell for 3 days and saturated the earth so deeply that worms came to the surface. Ha Min stood in the field in the rain and watched as the water seeped into the dark soil. 256 chon, half of what it used to be. But the soil was alive. The people were there. The seeds were in the granary, and he knew what to do. For the next 4 months, he worked harder than he ever had before. Seo organized the logistics. Da-eun arranged security. Soo-jin forged away without stopping. Na-yeon oversaw the planting. Sol walked through the fields, pointing out where the soil needed more and where it was enough. Ju-hee corresponded with 3 county courts simultaneously, defending Ha Min's right to the land. 250 people worked to the rhythm set by a single man in a work jacket with dirt under his fingernails. The 7th generation pink rice surpassed all previous crops. The grains were as large as beans. The pink color was bright and even. The aroma wafted 100 steps away as it cooked. Ha Min tasted the first handful and froze. Sweetish, delicate, with an aftertaste unlike any rice he'd ever tasted. He'd been cooking rice his whole life, in 2 worlds, and he had never eaten anything like it. He named it Pink Yun, not in his own honor, in honor of the first emperor who was also named Yun Chol. The name was inscribed on the last tablet of the Codex of the Earth. Another Yun from another century who had done the same thing in this very same place. He divided the Pink Yun harvest into 3 parts. 1/3 for seeds, 1/3 for trade, 1/3 for what Sia called madness and Ha Min called insurance. He distributed the pink rice seeds, for free, to every village that supported Chonan, to every family that worked his fields, to every merchant who transported his grain to the capital. Sia said he was giving away a monopoly. Ha Min replied that a monopoly was something he was fighting against, not something he was building. If pink rice grew everywhere, the House of So wouldn't be able to control it. It wouldn't be able to buy it all up. It wouldn't be able to burn it, because you can't burn something that's growing in 1,000 places at once. The seeds spread throughout the province, then to 2 places, then to 3. The peasants planted pink rice on their plots and couldn't believe their eyes when it sprouted. Pink panicles at sunset in villages where only stunted wheat had grown for 100 years. It was more than agronomy. It was a revolution, a quiet one, a green one, without a single shot fired. So Gyeongtaek realized he had lost when his own peasants began planting pink yun instead of his grain. His monopoly was crumbling. Prices were falling. Control was slipping away. He could burn 1 field. He couldn't burn 1,000. Meanwhile, in the south, the empire was falling apart. The southern provinces had revolted. An army of rebels, led by 3 generals, was marching on the capital. Roads were cut off. Caravans were being plundered. The capital was under siege. Grain wasn't reaching the capital. The people were starving. Emperor Li Gon, old and sick, sat in his palace and realized that his empire was dying. Not by the sword, by starvation. The rebel army did not storm the walls. They simply cut off the roads along which the grain traveled, and they waited. Starvation would do their work for them. After 3 weeks of the siege, riots broke out in the capital. After 5 weeks, bread cost more than silver. After 7 weeks, they were eating horse meat in the imperial palace. Li Gon did what no emperor had done in 1,000 years. He sent Ha Min not an order, not a demand, a request. A scroll on yellow silk bearing the imperial seal. 1 word, please. Ha Min read it. He looked at Ju Hee. She stood there, pale, biting her lip. It was her father, old, sick, hungry, the man who had wanted to sell her to a 60-year-old duke, and the man who had rocked her on his lap when she was 3 and sung a lullaby she still remembered. Ha Min gathered everyone together. Na-yeon, Soo-jin, Se-ah, Da-eun, Ju Hee, and Sol, the 6 women who had become his family. He asked, "We'll help." Their voices were unanimous. Yes. Se-ah said the supplies would be enough. If they sent everything beyond what was strictly necessary, they could load 30 carts. 30 carts of grain for the starving capital. It wouldn't save the city forever, but it would buy time. Time for negotiations, time for a truce, time for people to stop dying. Da-eun assigned 20 soldiers to guard the wagons. Soo-jin inspected every wagon. Na-yeon prepared sacks of medicinal herbs for the capital's infirmaries. Sol went around every sack of grain and said they were warm, that the grain was alive and wanted to travel. Ju Hee wrote a letter to her father, not as a princess, as a farmer. Short, without titles, without formalities. She wrote that she was sending grain, and that she had grown strawberries, and that she wouldn't be coming back. The convoys set out at dawn. 30 wagons loaded with grain, rice, peas, millet, radishes, sacks of flour, bundles of dried vegetables, baskets of Ju Hee's strawberries, and 1 small sack of pink yun seeds. Ha Min rode in the first wagon, wearing a work jacket, with dirt under his fingernails. The route passed through the territory of the House of So. Se-ah had planned it that way on purpose. Not a detour, straight through. Through villages where the peasants had been eating bread made from Ha Min's grain all year long. Through fields where pink yun was already growing from the seeds that had been distributed. Through lands where So's soldiers guarded the roads. The soldiers took to the road when the convoys appeared on the horizon. 30 wagons, 20 guards, against the So House garrison of 300 swordsmen. The garrison commander looked at the convoys, at the sacks of grain, at Ha Min sitting on the first wagon. Then he looked at his soldiers. Soldiers whose families lived in the villages that Ha Min had fed all year long. Soldiers whose children ate his peas and his rice. Soldiers who knew that these sacks contained grain for the capital, where people just like them were starving. The commander retreated. The convoys passed. No one drew a sword. At the capital's gates, the emperor met them. Not in the palace, at the gates. Li Gon came out himself, an old man in ceremonial robes that hung loosely on him because he had lost 20 li in weight over 2 months. Standing beside him was his entourage, generals, officials, courtiers, all hungry, all pale. The emperor saw the convoys and did what no ruler of Huachan in 1,000 years. He bowed. First, to the exile with a brand on his hand. Ha Min jumped down from the wagon. He did not bow in return because he did not know the proper way to bow to the emperor. He simply walked up. He took a small pouch from his bosom and held it out. He said they were seeds, pink rice. If planted in the palace garden in the spring, it would be beautiful. The emperor took the pouch with both hands. His hands were trembling, not from old age, but because someone had traveled across the entire empire to bring him not weapons or gold, but seeds. Ju-hee stood behind Ha Min. The emperor saw her. He froze. She stepped forward, in simple clothes, with weather-beaten hands, holding a basket of strawberries. She held it out to her father. She said that she was now a farmer. The emperor looked at his daughter, at the strawberries, at her hands, which were the hands of a laborer, not a princess. His eyes welled up with tears. He took the strawberries. Ha Min waited until the wagons were unloaded and the people were fed. Then he requested an audience. Not a feast, not a ceremony, a conversation. The emperor received him in a small hall, just the two of them, without an entourage. Ha Min sat across from him and placed two items on the table, the charter of the land and the final tablet of the codex, bearing the name Yoon Chol, with text in Korean that the emperor could not read. Ha Min explained about the codex, about the treaty, about the first emperor who came from another world and revived the dead land, about how Ha Min had come in the same way, from another world, from another time, and had done the same thing, about the law of doubling, which is not magic but an ancient treaty between man and the earth, about Moon Sol, the last descendant of the first emperor, about the fact that, according to the codex, Ha Min is the rightful heir. The emperor listened in silence. Then he asked what Ha Min wanted. The crown, the throne, the empire. Ha Min shook his head. He said he didn't want the crown. He didn't want the throne. He didn't want the empire. He wanted only one thing, for the emperor to sign a declaration stating that the earth is alive, that it must not be killed with salt and blood, that it belongs to those who nourish it, and that no one in this empire has the right to starve people to death for the sake of control. That grain is not a weapon, that food is not a luxury, that every child on this continent has the right to hot porridge and a sweet tomato. The emperor looked at him for a long time, at the man in a work jacket with dirt under his fingernails, at the outcast bearing a brand, at the agronomist from another world, at the one who could have taken the empire but instead asked him to sign a document about porridge. He picked up the brush. He signed it. Ha Min's supply trains fed the capital for 3 weeks. During that time, the southern generals agreed to negotiations, not because they were afraid of the army, because their own soldiers had begun to desert. They were fleeing to the villages where pink yun grew, where the earth was alive, where they were fed. The war did not end with a sword. It ended with rice. Ha Min returned to Chongnon a month later, in a creaking wagon, wearing the same work jacket, carrying a new sack of seeds given to him by the capital's gardeners. All 250 people were there to greet him, and another 100 newcomers, refugees from the south who had arrived while he was away. Saya took them in, settled them, put them to work. The plot now stretched to the horizon. 1,024 chon, 256 hectares, an entire kingdom, a byproduct. He didn't want a kingdom. He wanted people to eat, and they did. In the evening, he sat by the campfire. Na-yeon sat next to him, sorting through the seeds of the new harvest. The pink grains in her fingers glistened in the firelight. Sujin was sharpening a new sickle and grumbling that the metal was soft these days and a pain to work with. Se-ah was writing next year's plan in her notebook. Da-eun was reading aloud to the children by torchlight. 30 children sat around her, listening with their mouths agape. Ju-hee was washing the dishes after dinner and quietly humming a lullaby her father used to sing to her. Sol was lying on the grass, gazing at the stars. 2 moons hung above the horizon, one yellow, one blue. Ha Min was cooking porridge, rice with peas, dried mushrooms, and wild onions. He added a pinch of salt and ladled it into bowls, 7 bowls in all, 6 for them, 1 for himself. The porridge was hot and thick, and its aroma made the stomachs of passing peasants churn. Not because the porridge was special, but because it was cooked by a man who knew that food isn't just calories, food is care. He looked out at the field beyond the campfire. Dark, quiet, sleeping until spring. Land that a year ago had been gray dust and now fed hundreds of people. Land that he had brought back to life with his bare hands, 1 square meter at a time. Somewhere far away in the capital, the emperor sat in the palace garden and looked at a small garden bed where the first sprouts of pink yun were poking out of the ground. In the palace garden where, for 1,000 years, only ornamental pines had grown for 1,000 years, rice was now growing.
Pink rice planted by the hands of the old emperor, who had dirtied his fingers for the first time in his life. Ha Min didn't know this, but if he had, he would have smiled. That very quiet smile of an agronomist who sees that a seed has sprouted. He finished his porridge. He washed the bowl. He lay down next to the campfire and closed his eyes. Tomorrow there would be a lot of work. New fields, new seeds, new people to feed, new problems to solve. But this was the right kind of work. Work that brings the earth to life. Work that feeds people. And work that makes the world a little better. 1 square meter at a time.